The next item of business is a statement by Paul Wheelhouse on severe winter weather impacts and Scotland's response. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and there should therefore be no interruptions or interventions. I call on Paul Wheelhouse. Minister, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to update the Chamber on the impacts across Scotland of the severe winter weather experienced over the festive period, and to detail the tremendous work carried out by emergency services, other responders, local communities and individuals to mitigate the impacts of the storms during the past 2 weeks. As I've seen myself when visiting areas affected by flooding, there is no good time to be hit with flood damage, power outages, transport disruption and other severe weather impacts. However, facing these scenarios over the Christmas and New Year period was particularly challenging, both for families and businesses, dealing with the impacts for those across the responder organisations tasked with dealing with the consequences. Although thankfully small in number, our thoughts are with all those whose Christmas and New Year was adversely affected by the weather, whether through short periods of lost power, property flooding or disrupted travel. Particular credit must go to the many hundreds of staff across police, fire and rescue, local authorities, utility companies and other key organisations who sacrificed big elements of the Christmas and New Year period to ensure a safe and secure festive period for so many. The Scottish Government Resilience Operation had already been active earlier in December, working in partnership with agencies and organisations like SEPA, Transport Scotland, Police Scotland, power companies and local authorities on weather issues before the severe weather that impacted on the festive period. Thanks to the Resilience Partnership's work that has been developed across Scotland, responders were given an early warning by the Met Office in the week before Christmas of the potential severe weather to come. This put all the relevant organisations at national and local level on alert and allowed them to warn and inform the public of what was expected, what they could do to protect themselves and what mitigating action was being taken by the authorities, including the targeted deployment of staff and resources to the areas most likely to be affected. The Scottish Government's Resilience Room was activated and the Emergency Committee held 15 meetings from Christmas Eve through until this week, including Christmas Day, Hogmanay and New Year's Day, with involvement throughout from ministers across relevant portfolios and with close involvement from the First Minister. This coordinated effort, with the regular sharing of detailed information on the location and level of risks faced by areas across Scotland, helped to ensure that local authorities, the emergency services and the communities they represent were able to put in place crucial protection measures and prepare for the worst of the weather impacts. This has included, for example, the use of demountable defences in Oban, which stopped floodwater reaching the heart of the town, and the deployment of Dumfries and Galloway's mobile flood pod, which I saw for myself last week, providing flood protection equipment, including floodgates, to properties in Dumfries and Newton Stewart. Presiding Officer, no one in this chamber would ever expect Scotland to be immune from severe weather through the winter months, and what we have experienced so far, while not unprecedented, has been particularly unusual. In order to compare the recent spell with numerous stormy periods of weather in the past, the Met Office's National Climate Information Centre has done an analysis of the number of weather stations in Scotland which have registered winds over certain thresholds since the start of December. This measure suggests that December 2013 was one of the stormiest months in Scotland since January 1993. Temperatures for the month were well above average, especially over Scotland. Indeed, for Scotland and for the UK overall, this was the mildest December since 1988. But with respect to rainfall, this was Scotland's wettest December in the records dating back to 1910, with many areas seeing nearly twice the average rainfall and with few dry spells to allow saturated land to drain and high river, loch and reservoir levels to reduce. By way of just one example, Callander received some 540 millimetres of rain in December, some 21 inches of rain, or 240% of the average for the area, and with 18 of those days receiving more than 20 millimetres of rain. We will no doubt face further spells of challenging weather before winter is out, so vigilance remains the key word, and our resilience operation will continue to actively monitor the weather situation and work with partners to identify potential threats and to respond accordingly over the coming weeks. A widespread flood risk was continually present across the festive period. Indeed, there have been flood warnings in place for parts of Tayside continually since mid-December. As at 12:45 this afternoon, there were still 7 flood warnings and 3 flood alerts in place across Scotland, despite the relatively improved weather picture of the last few days. While most of the weather we saw was in line with normal winter expectation, it was unusual to see front after front without sustained breaks which would allow saturated ground and river catchments to recover from the abnormally high levels of rainfall. This was combined by the effects of tidal surges in the west and the east, and in places very strong winds providing periods of coastal flood risk. Some smaller catchments are particularly responsive to severe rainfall events, as I saw when I visited Jedburgh in my capacity as a regional member. And parts of Dumfries and Galloway, the Borders and Ayrshire saw some of the worst flooding in living memory. whilst communities on large parts of the West Coast, the islands, the various East Coast firths and the North East experienced the damaging effect of storm surges, high tides and severe gales. The joint SEPA Met Office Scottish Flood Forecasting Service was active in providing early guidance of flood risk to local responders. This was invaluable in allowing them to put in place measures to respond to potential flooding. Unfortunately, it was not possible to prevent flooding everywhere, but the efforts of our responders consistently helped to mitigate its impacts. I heard firsthand how important this early notification was during my visit to see the effects of flooding in Dumfries and in visiting Govan Police Station to witness the preparedness efforts against coastal flooding. In addition to the work proactively supporting the emergency responders, SEPA was engaging directly with the public through their excellent floodline direct warning system, providing flood warnings and alerts to the public, allowing them to make informed decisions as to managing their own potential flood risk. Over the last month, SEPA issued a total of 360 flood alert and flood warning messages, which meant almost 100,000 text or telephone alerts to customers registered with Floodline. And since mid-December, SEPA have had 1,250 new registrations to their Floodline service, an increase of 7%, with almost 18,200 people across flood-vulnerable areas of Scotland now registered for this valuable service. This is an invaluable resource, and I would encourage members to help publicise this resource and further increase registrations. I'm sure that members will also wish to support me in reiterating my thanks to emergency responders across Scotland. Despite their own personal commitments and desires for the festive period, they were consistently available and active in taking proportionate responses to identified flood risk and protecting our communities. This preparedness was essential and invaluable. However, in terms of flood risk management, it is only part of the picture. Next week, I will host a summit with local authorities and other key partners such as Scottish Water and SEPA. At this, we will take stock of the work, which will culminate during the latter stages of 2014-15 to produce the first ever round of flood risk management plans. These are informed by SEPA's work on producing our first ever national flood risk assessment, new flood risk and hazard maps, which SEPA will also publicise next week, identifying the sources and receptors of flood risk, including mapping velocity and depth of flows to inform local responders. And this will inform the flood risk management strategies across the whole of Scotland and support us to target efforts to plan and invest in reducing impacts in areas vulnerable to flooding. Investment is essential to support efforts to manage and, where possible, reduce flood risk. In the light of this demonstration of the potential impacts flooding can have on communities, businesses, transport networks and individuals, I reiterate that flood risk management is a priority for Scottish Government. And whilst a relatively small number of properties have been damaged by localised flooding, we have not experienced the significant damage or disruption seen in other parts of the UK, to whom I extend my own sympathies. And the benefits of the flood warning and flood risk management action demonstrates value from our investment. We have continuously maintained and protected our support to SEPA, and in conjunction with our partners, COSLA maintained the element of local authority settlement identified for flood protection. The Scottish Government has continued to invest in supporting actions to reduce flood risk, including protecting SEPA's budget at £37.5 million and increasing it in challenging financial circumstances to £39.5 million in 2015-16. Local authorities can also apply for funding for large new flood protection schemes using capital funding worth £42 million a year. This investment is making a difference and will stand us in good stead, and will aim to continue to maintain this as we move forward, recognising that climate change raises an expectation of more frequent severe weather events, not least because the recent IPCC projections of 0.26 metre to 0.83 metre increase in global sea levels, which would see our sea defences come under ever-increasing pressure. Over the immediate Christmas period, around 26,000 customers experienced power disruption due to the extreme high winds. The majority of these customers in locations right across Scotland were reconnected within a few hours, and very few were without power for more than 24 hours. During the rest of the festive period, a small number of customers, hundreds rather than thousands, suffered power outages at various points, with almost all of them restored to power within an hour. And remarkable effort given the fact this was achieved despite very testing conditions. And both Scottish Power and Southern Energy, Scottish and Southern Energy Power Distribution deal with harsh conditions every winter in Scotland, and as a result were well prepared for the situation that arose. In many cases giving up their own time, they again, 875 linesmen, engineers, contractors and tree cutters and more than 140 call centre staff deserve our thanks for their efforts in very challenging conditions. And both companies deserve our praise and in recognition for their tremendous effort in Scotland over the festive period. And my colleague Fergus Ewing has written to Ofgem to ensure that the Scottish Government's support for the efforts of Scottish Power and SEC is properly recognised given the post-mortem currently being undertaken by Ofgem. Presiding Officer, Scotland's transport network stood up remarkably well to the severe weather conditions, and through the swift action of dedicated staff, disruption was kept to a minimum. Inevitably, given the storm-force winds and terrible sea conditions, our ferry services were worst hit, but operators tried to be as flexible as possible to make journeys when it was safe to do so. This included CalMac making the unprecedented step of running special sailings to North Euston Harris on Christmas Day, and again, we should recognise and applaud the public spiritedness of CalMac staff. Transport Scotland's Traffic Control Centre was active in monitoring the situation. My colleague Keith Brown was involved throughout, and the multi-agency coordination team was stood up to help manage emerging issues. In recognition of the financial burden that severe weather incidents and their impacts can have on local authorities, on behalf of the Scottish Government, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, John Swinney, has formally triggered the Bellwyn scheme on Hogmanay. And, Presiding Officer, as I said earlier, what Scotland has faced over the past 2 weeks may not have been unprecedented, but it has been particularly unusual, and this did present real challenges for responders and communities they sought to protect. The same could be said about response of many authorities and organisations involved in keeping Scotland running. It was not an unprecedented response. They were all well practised in working in partnership, and it was indeed unusual and exceptional circumstances given the scale of the response and the sacrifice of many who gave up their own festive celebrations to make sure others could enjoy theirs. We always look to learn lessons, but, Presiding Officer, we can be proud that when a severe test was presented, Scotland's responders demonstrated they were resilient in the face of that challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. The Minister will now take questions on issues raised in the statement. I will allow around 20 minutes for questions, and then we'll move on to next business. Members who wish to ask a question of the Minister should press the request to speak button now. And I call Claudia Beamish. Ms Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Minister for early sight of the statement. The holiday period, as the Minister has already acknowledged, is a time when we should all be able to relax, and indeed has been a very challenging time for many households and communities due to the severe weather. And it is essential that the Scottish Government now gives all possible support to those affected as they come to terms with the way forward after the initial clear-up. So this statement is a welcome step. Can the Minister please clarify how the budget for the Bellwyn scheme will be distributed and what the application process is and indeed what the budget is? I have concerns, though, over the floodline warning systems for the future and want to highlight to the Minister that it was not possible to get detailed advice in Clydesdale by Friday the 3rd of January, despite it being an area that was severely flooded earlier in the week. And the Rural Affairs Committee argued in the budget recommendations, and I quote, "It is essential that to ensure greater consistency across Scotland. Can the Minister guarantee that this will be urgently reviewed? Can he also give us an update on flood insurance issues? Partnership working is an imperative, and it would be helpful if the Minister could clarify what assessment has been made as to whether there should be any alteration to present arrangements for communication between partners, including local authorities, and if there will be a report from next week's Welcome Summit. Robust funding for coastal and river flood defences has now been sadly proven to be an even more urgent need, and the response was certainly rapid, and we can't prevent floods everywhere, as the Minister has highlighted. But could it be possible that the Minister will be able to urgently review the budget in view of these severe weather patterns? And alongside, finally, these funding imperatives lie the Scottish Government commitments to climate change mitigation. In this context, can the Minister also clarify what arrangements are in place for the research budget into this and whether these could possibly be increased due to the severe weather developments?
Minister.
Hopefully I'll be able to cover all of those questions to some degree or other. In relation to, I welcome Claudia Beamish's sort of positive tone in terms of her contribution. Certainly in terms of the deployment of Bellwyn, as the member knows, I'm sure, it's based on eligibility for funding. So there's well-specified criteria in which funding is eligible for coverage by Bellwyn. I think we should welcome the fact that the scheme is open, and indeed I'm sure that was reassuring to the likes of Dumfries and Galway Council when I met them, that they knew that Bellwyn would help them in this situation with exceptional costs. It is on the basis of repairs on a like-for-like basis, and eligibility rules are are quite strict in that respect, but I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary for Finance will look at any applications that come in and deal with them very fairly. In terms of the communication between parties, I'd say we are looking, as with every incident, looking at where perhaps there might be improvements, and if there are messages that come forward about how we've just moved to a new Police Scotland structure and we've got our three new regional partnerships in place, and this is the first major test that they've faced. So I'd be surprised if there weren't things that came out of it that we need to tighten up on. I certainly give the member an assurance that if any messages are of that nature, that I will act on them and make sure that we address any communication difficulties. In terms of the urgency, it was dealt with, I think, with all due urgency. I would point out in terms of the budget that the Scottish Government deploys, the £42 million in terms of the capital funding, on a basis of properties at risk. It works out roughly about 3 times as much as is funded per property at risk in England. So therefore we can be relatively comfortable about the level of resource that the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government is dedicating to this task. But we, as always, will keep these issues under close watch and ensure that we try and provide as much resource as possible to tackle what is, as the member rightly identified, a severe test for us as a society moving forward with climate change in the future. And in terms of climate mitigation, I certainly agree it reinforces the urgency with all societies, but specifically Scotland, in relation to the role of the Scottish Parliament, that we should take our responsibilities to climate mitigation very seriously. And I can assure the member, as I'm sure she's aware, it's a very high priority for me as a Minister.
Alex Johnson.
Thank you very much. Can I begin by thanking the Minister for advance sight of his statement and adding my thanks to those he thanked during the course of his statement. For those who had to suffer Christmas Day without electricity, the difficulties were significant, I'm sure, but nothing compared with those who spent Christmas Day up a pole in the teeth of a driving gale and driving rain trying to return power supplies. Can I also add my thanks to those of the Minister, to those ferry operators. He mentioned Calmac, I believe. I would like to add and extend these thanks to Scotland's many outstanding private ferry operators who also demonstrated the extreme public service motivation which lies behind their business model, and they should be subject to our thanks too. Moving on specifically to the questions I would like to ask, they relate to SEPA. The first one is a fairly specific one, and that is to ask the Minister if the delay to the regional pluvial, fluvial and coastal contracts and the subsequent delay in SEPA's submission of flood risk and flood hazard maps to the European Union are likely to lead to delay in the flood risk management plans to be published by 2015. And on the subject of SEPA, I acknowledge that the Minister's considerable effort in relation to floods which happened a year ago in my own backyard in Stonehaven and his very timely visit to that situation. But the year that has passed since then have indicated that SEPA may be a stumbling block towards short-term and effective remedy of some of the flooding causes in that situation. However, it may also be the case that SEPA are used as the excuse for other agencies who are unable to act in a timely way. So I would ask, being of a representative of the government which very effectively straightened out, should I say, SEPA in 2008, if it is perhaps time to look at SEPA's actions in relation to flood management to see if there is any improvement that may be made to the structures or whether the problem lies somewhere else. Minister.
Can I first of all identify with the comments that Mr Johnson made in regard to the private ferry operators? I'm indeed aware that they also played a very important role during the troubles we had over the festive period. In terms of SEPA's contribution, I would just highlight, first of all, the very positive contribution they make now, enabling us to be prepared for such incidents. The flood warning systems they have in place are of huge value, and I heard that directly from responders in Dumfries and elsewhere, that the predictability of when floodwaters are going to peak, and indeed key industrial sites like Grangemouth as well, being able to predict that floodwaters will hit at a certain time of day and within very tight margins, has been hugely helpful to those operators of those key sites and local responders. In terms of the particular issue about the flood risk plans and the new maps which are being produced, I actually met with David Sigthworth, James Curran and colleagues this morning to get an update. They did actually meet the December deadline just in terms of providing the maps, but nonetheless it's a very challenging task, and they've had to marshal a huge amount of data from local authorities. In fact, in some cases, local authorities saying the data they've had to provide to underpin these maps has effectively doubled the amount of data they have to store at a local authority level. So that's just to give you an idea of the scale of the task that's involved. It will be challenging to meet December's deadline to have the maps finalised and the action plans put in place. But we are still aiming for that deadline, and that's something that clearly, if there are resource issues, the government will try and do what we can to assist SEPA. One of the capacity issues is physically the number of quality hydrologists there are available to us, and we have in the past tried to pump prime the number of hydrologists coming through the university sector in order to underpin the workforce that we need. But I'd certainly give the member an assurance that it's something I'm going to keep an eye on and do what I can to support SEPA in terms of resourcing. On the issue of SEPA being a scapegoat, I have seen some reporting that has suggested that SEPA are being unfairly blamed in some cases for the problems that are encountered at a local level, and I will teach each case that arises on its own merits and make representations if need be on that front. But certainly in Stonehaven, I hope the member welcomes the Karen scheme is now up and running, so we now have a warning scheme in place, and that's just an example of the investment programme that SEPA have put in place to ensure that we can equip local responders and local communities with the quality of information they need to make the kind of timely response that we saw over the last couple of weeks. So I hope that gives them some assurance that SEPA are doing everything, and they treat it as a very high priority, as do I.
Members will note, I'm sure, that we've only got 10 minutes left to have 9 questioners. I need to protect the debate that's coming afterwards, because that is very tight for time. So I can't allow any more time on the ministerial statement. So can you keep the questions and answers as short as you can, and that way we can get everybody in. Richard Lyle, followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I welcome this ministerial statement and the hard work done by the Minister and other ministers over the last few weeks. Due to the high level of rainfall and severe wind conditions in the past weeks in Scotland, what further steps is the Minister taking to ensure that all vital services are safeguarded in order to minimise disruption to residents, and what lessons has he learned?
Minister.
Well, I'll try and keep this as brief as possible, but certainly in terms of transport, we appreciate the efforts that were made by Keith Brown throughout the period to keep in close control of what was happening. We will certainly, we can't control the weather, and disruption can never be ruled out, of course, and we've identified in the course of the coastal event that happened, obviously some particular vulnerability points in terms of the Ardrossan line and other areas which we need to be mindful of. But because we've experienced this before, steps were taken by the transport operators to make sure they had replacement bus services in place in advance of expecting this to happen. We obviously make sure that the lessons of previous events and winters are identified, considered and acted upon where they're known, and improve we certainly improved the operation of the government's own emergency arrangements, including the Traffic Scotland National Control Centre at Queensferry, which I know Keith Brown was virtually camped in at one point during the period. And already this winter, the MART has been activated 6 times for instances of high winds, heavy rain and high-risk times. So we do remain ready for severe weather events on our trunk roads, and we have invested in new equipment and materials, including gritters, icebreakers and alternate de-icers, which, despite the weather we've had recently, may well need to still be deployed at some point this winter. And we've improved the communication with our key operators like CalMac and the private ferry operators to make sure services run as smoothly as they possibly can.
Jackie Bailey, followed by Lee MacLeod.
Can I also thank the staff in Western Berkshire and Argyll and Bute, but I'm sure the Minister will acknowledge that the areas that are flooding are the areas that have ever flooded. Can I therefore ask him whether flood prevention schemes currently under development at the River, Leven and Gruggies Burn are likely to attract support from the Scottish Government?
Minister.
I will happily meet with the member to discuss the specifics of the schemes in relation to the Leven. Clearly, there is a process in place with our partners, COSLA, to assess all applications which come on over at £2 million or above. I'm not sure of the specifics in terms of the cost in relation to the scheme in the Leven, but I imagine it's a substantial one. So there is a well-established mechanism. We have an open application process at the moment. The deadline is 21st of January, and whether it's this round or a subsequent round, I'm certainly very gratified that COSLA have agreed to continue the arrangement for pooling those resources and funding the major schemes that we need to address as a country to make sure that our key communities are protected on the basis of timely and appropriate investment. So I'm certainly happy to meet the member to discuss the particular project.
Lee MacLeod, followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister will be aware that many settlements on the Dumfries and Galloway coast were affected by the severe weather, and at present the region only receives a general warning of the likelihood of this sort of event. So given the length and the varied topography of the region's coastline, will the Minister give consideration to how more specific and localised coastal flood warnings can be issued in future?
Minister.
Certainly, and I know we've recently implemented the Forth and Tay coastal warning scheme, which does mean that there's, I think, 11 or 12, I'll check the number, but 11 or 12 different loci along the coastline which have specific warnings in place, including Eyemouth, the place I live closest to. We have, and I hope that reassure the member, that SEPA in their forward programme for developing warning schemes have one in place and planned for 2015 for the Solway coast. And that would involve, similarly, a detailed number of locations across the coastline to give detailed warning. But we are, I've said to the Dumfries and Galloway Council leader and Chief Executive that I look to them to come to me with any advice as to particular sites in and river systems in Dumfries and Galloway where they feel it would add particular value, and then we will look at what resources are required to provide that.
Tavish Scott, followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you. Will the Minister ensure that the Belwyn formula applies to the subsea cable that was broken between Shetland and the UK network, therefore cutting off broadband and mobile communications on the 28th of December? Would he ensure that those kind of communications that will be invested in this year by BT across the whole of the west coast of Scotland are protected in the future? And will he investigate how that best be done?
Minister.
I can't give any assurances on the specifics, but I'm happy to look at the issue that the member mentions because I appreciate the severity of it to the local economy in Shetland, and I will liaise with my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, just as to what the eligibility would be under Belwyn. But happy to look at that particular issue if he's to write to me.
Sarah Boyack, followed by Dennis Robertson.
Can the Minister clarify whether Phase 2 of Edinburgh's Vital Flood scheme will be eligible for funding from the £42 million he referred to, as this much-delayed £25 million scheme is currently £6 million short?
Minister.
The position we have with COSLA on that one is that it's obviously COSLA to prioritise which schemes that are funded, but we have, in the case of the Water of Leith, a scheme which is a historic one that has been funded to date, so we have already committed funding. I appreciate the difficulties the Edinburgh Council faced in terms of procurement. They've ended up with a more expensive contract or contracts than they had anticipated and faced exceptional costs. But we have a number of other schemes which we have to try and fund. We have legacy schemes from previous legislation in Brecon, and the electric scheme has come forward, and others which will be applying by the 21st of January deadline. So all I can say is that I will happily meet with the members. I've met with Mr Biaggi to discuss a similar issue, to explore the actual detail in this case and to explain the circumstances in relation to the current funding package.
Dennis Robertson, followed by Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Constituents in Aberdeenshire West, especially in the area like Huntly, have benefited from the flood prevention methods that are already in place and welcome the early warning alert systems. Can the Minister perhaps expand on the comments he's made regarding the Scottish Government's resilience work that's going on a national basis? And does he believe that the work that took place over the last few weeks actually worked well?
Minister.
Well, I certainly would preface it by saying that we always look to learn from anything that didn't go well and try and improve on it. I've not had anything brought to me yet that demonstrate there's any issue in this respect, but thanks to the joint work we have developed across the partners, and I obviously stress the role of local government, police, fire and indeed local responders, and indeed our transport operators and power companies, we do have all relevant organisations at a national and local level working together to ensure we prepare for such events and to respond in a resilient fashion as we possibly can. So our resilience officials constantly monitor the situation. They will then feed back any examples of where things didn't work well into learning points that we then take forward for any similar instance. And I think it's key where we have floods in places that aren't covered by schemes like Newton Stewart or other locations at the moment, we learn from the exact circumstances which affected them and then feed that back in. So if a similar situation arises in weather terms, we can predict that something similar might happen at that local level until such time as hopefully we can have a warning scheme in place.
Rob Gibson, followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, how have the repairs to the 2 dozen or so harbours damaged by the storms of December 2012 from Caithness south held up in this winter's storms as they've been joined by damage on the west coast due to higher tides, record high waves and heavier rainfall, which I believe have become a new and worrying norm?
Minister.
Well, certainly the Government has been proactive in supporting a number of fisheries harbours that were damaged as a consequence of the storms in December 2012. I can tell the member that the feedback we've had from resilience partnerships that none of these have been damaged or further incidents been repeated, but obviously we'll wait to see what detailed applications come in for Belwyn from local authorities, just in case anything has been missed.
Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Along with the local councillors, I attended New Cumnock over the festive period, particularly on Miller Road, which was very badly affected by the flood. I can confirm the Minister's view that the efforts of police, fire, local authority and utility services was deeply satisfactory as far as they were concerned. However, there was a point raised about the accumulation of silt in the nearby Afton River, and an indication that it was believed locally that this was as a result of a policy supported by SEPA, and wondered, is this policy in fact in place, and is it something that should be reconsidered, given that the water that was displaced by that silt affected the local community?
Minister.
I'm certainly very happy to look at that specific issue, because I'm aware that twice in the last couple of weeks there were problems in the Afton, and that silt and gravel build-up can cause problems. I would just cite the allegation might be at local level that it's SEPA that are responsible for this in some respect, but bear in mind that SEPA, as our Scottish Government, are bound by European directives. So we need to look in relation to the Afton to see if it's an issue relating to the Habitats Directive and some specific issues there in regards to compliance with European regulation, or if it's indeed just an operational issue that we can sort out more easily.
My apologies to Stuart McMillan. I'm sorry, Mr McMillan, I'm unable to call you. We need to move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney on Scotland's economy. Members who wish to speak in this debate should press the request to speak button now. And at this juncture, could I just remind the open debate speakers that speeches will be limited to 5 minutes. I now call John Swinney to speak to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this opportunity to update Parliament on the Scottish economy and to lead this debate on the opportunities for strengthening our long-term growth prospects. 2014 promises to be an important year for the Scottish economy. There are clear signs that the recovery is beginning to gather momentum, with the most stable, if not most universally positive outlook for the global economy since the financial crisis. 2014 is also the year when the eyes of the world will be on Scotland. Events such as Homecoming, the Commonwealth Games and the Ryder Cup will provide a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to showcase our nation to a global audience and to use this to maximise the benefits to our economy. And of course, in September of this year, the people of Scotland will have the chance to decide upon who is best placed to look after Scotland's economy in the future and to generate greater economic prosperity and equality through a vote for Scottish independence. Last month, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's Chief Economist published the latest State of the Economy report. This documented the relatively positive signs of economic recovery over the past year. Over the quarter to quarter 2 2013, the Scottish economy grew in each and every quarter. We continue to make progress from the financial crisis, with output in Scotland now 1.4% below its pre-recession peak in quarter 2, with the UK 2.7% below in the same quarter. The labour market has also strengthened over the year. The latest statistics show employment levels in Scotland increasing by 83,000 over the year to October 2013, and we still outperform the UK on all of the labour market indicators that we observe. Core business surveys for Scotland, such as the Purchasing Managers Index, report that private sector output continued to expand through the 2 final quarters of 2013, and confidence is gradually returning to the business sector in Scotland. This is testament to the inherent strength of the Scottish economy and also to the measures that have been taken to ensure that the investment that the Scottish Government has at its disposal is used as effectively as we possibly can do to support and to encourage the growth of the Scottish economy in such difficult circumstances. I certainly will.
Tavish Scott.
To the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Is he aware that there is currently an industrial dispute pending at the Sunvo plant between Petrovac, the contractor for the Total gas plant, and the union? Has he had a chance in his busy day to be in touch with either the contractor or indeed the union, given the potential to disrupt what is at the moment the largest civil engineering contract in Britain?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Mr Scott will be aware from the keen interest that ministers take in the issues that affect industrial relations and their impact on the economy, as we demonstrated in the situation in Grangemouth just in the last few weeks, that ministers will be prepared to do all that we possibly can do to bring parties together in all of these disputes, as I know Mr Scott will appreciate. The primary opportunity to resolve these issues is by direct dialogue between management and workforce, and ministers will certainly do everything we possibly can do to assist in that respect. And if there is any particular perspective he has as a local member, I will of course be very happy to hear that and to take that forward in any way that we possibly can do. And Mr Scott makes an important point about the importance of good and strong and positive employment relations in our economy to ensure that there is maximum positive benefit for the development of the Scottish economy, and that lies at the heart of the objectives of ministers in this respect. Presiding Officer, as we embark on an important year of political discussion in Scotland, it's important, I think, when there is such a concentration on the points of dispute and debate, to perhaps look at some of the areas that are broadly agreed between both sides of the constitutional argument in Scotland. We both agree that Scotland could be a successful independent country. We both agree that devolution and the transfer of decision-making powers from Westminster to Scotland has brought major benefits to people living here in Scotland. The improvements in economic performance since devolution show what can be achieved, even with limited economic self-determination. For example, in 1999, Scotland's onshore output per head was the 5th highest of the 12 countries and regions of the United Kingdom. By 2012, it had risen to the 3rd highest, behind only London and the South East. At the time of devolution, Scotland had a lower employment rate and a higher unemployment rate compared to the UK, but our employment rate is now higher and our unemployment rate lower. The lesson I take from those examples is that where we are able to exercise self-determination here in Scotland, where we are able to take decisions that affect the circumstances and the conditions of the Scottish economy, we take wise and beneficial decisions that lead to sustained improvement in our long-term prospects. And that should be at the heart of the debate that we face in relation to the referendum on Scotland's constitutional future. The whole question of vesting responsibility here in Scotland, where we can take a set of decisions that are appropriate and necessary for the economic conditions here in Scotland. Now, in the debate today, there will be much to discuss about the nature of the economic recovery, and the Conservative amendment today invites us to applaud the United Kingdom Government on the steps that they have taken in relation to economic policy. Can I simply say to Mr Johnson, who is the most audible on this subject, even from a sedentary position, the current recovery in Scotland is taking place despite the policies of the UK Government, not because of them. The fundamental mistake the United Kingdom Government has made has been to prolong the economic difficulty and damage that has been faced by people in this country. It is the decision of the UK Government to reduce, for example, our capital budget in real terms by 27% over the period between 2010-11 and 2015-16 can only be described as one of the worst decisions which undermines and impedes economic recovery in Scotland. And if I go back to some of the arguments that we've had in this Parliament before about the fact that when I've advanced the argument about the importance... of course I'll give way. Yes.
Gavin Brown.
Is the entire economic recovery then down to the Scottish Government?
What I'd say to Mr Brown, as I have marshalled in this parliamentary chamber on countless occasions before, the Scottish Government has dealt with the circumstances we have faced as a consequence of United Kingdom Government policy, and our task would have been made much more practical and easy if we had not had impediments like a 27% cut in our capital budget imposed upon us by the United Kingdom Government. And if I think about some of the... of course I'll give way to Mr Rennie.
I hear what the Finance Secretary says, but he has stood there before and said that the UK Coalition Economic Plan would not work. How does he explain 1.3 million extra jobs across the UK?
Cabinet Secretary.
What I've said to Parliament before is that we needed to have more sustained capital investment to minimise the suffering that people have endured, and if Mr Rennie and his colleagues are prepared to turn a blind eye to the volume of suffering that has been experienced by members of the public by the prolonging of the economic difficulties that we have faced, then that is not something with which I want to be associated. I would have rather invested in the Scottish economy, not have to deal with the cuts imposed by Mr Rennie's administration. And of course, different steps could have been taken because the Chancellor has had to take different steps. Compared to his spending plans in 2010, the Chancellor has had to borrow an extra £197 billion more than was projected in 2010 and has failed to deliver nearly 6% worth of value in the economy that was predicted in 2010, according to his original plans. So I think when we look at the issues that we face in relation to the condition of the United Kingdom economy, when we look at the challenges that we have faced as an administration, we have tried very hard to focus our economic policy and our investments on overcoming some of the obstacles presented to us by the decisions taken by the United Kingdom Government. Now, the Scottish Government sets out in our budget, and will come on in the course of the next fortnight, to discuss the different parliamentary stages of the Government's budget programme, which is of course focused in a whole variety of different areas, whether that's on the development of skills, or on the execution of our capital investment programme, or about the steps taken forward to ensure that all aspects of policy in government are focused on economic growth, to ensure that the programme and policy development that we exercise within our own competence is maximised, to ensure that it contributes towards economic growth in Scotland. We, for example, as a government, have attached a significant amount of attention to ensuring that business in Scotland were able to take forward their investments in Scotland from the point of view of knowing that they operated within the most competitive business rates regime in the United Kingdom. We're very proud of the fact that over 90,000 small businesses in Scotland are currently able to pay either reduced business rates or no business rates. That's a policy commitment that we confirm very firmly to Parliament today, that we believe that our manifesto commitments to support the small business community with a small business bonus scheme, that we should have businesses in Scotland paying the same poundage that businesses in England pay. We believe those are important commitments to ensure that the business community in Scotland is able to plan for the future and able to invest in the operations and the activities of the business community. Now, and we will continue to assert those during the course of the parliamentary passage of the budget. Presiding Officer, this government makes it clear that there is a certain amount of economic impact that we can achieve through the responsibilities that we currently have, but there is more that we would want to do with the greater powers of independence. We would want to focus policy much more through using the tax system to support innovation and the development of new technologies. We would want to ensure that an integrated tax system that was integrated and drawn together the various aspects of corporate taxation with the needs of our economy, or the links between employability and personal taxation and welfare policies were all linked together in a coherent way, that we could ensure that that system operated on a more focused and efficient basis, that thirdly we could take forward steps to support the development of a more integrated global economy originating from Scotland with even greater success than we've managed to deliver in the whole field of inward investment, in which the government's record is very strong. And then finally, in boosting participation in the labour market, which we believe to be of fundamental importance to ensuring the growth and the development of the Scottish economy. At the heart of the White Paper that was published in November is the Government's commitment to expand by a transformational level the volume of childcare that's available within Scotland, and we've explained through Scotland's Future how that can only be done by having the scale of resources available to us to redeploy resources that we believe should be better spent in Scotland by investing in childcare rather than being spent on supporting the weapons of mass destruction that are currently supported by the public finances of the United Kingdom.
Cabinet Secretary, 1 minute left.
But what our priority is to make sure that we use those resources for the maximum economic benefit within Scotland. We can take some of the steps the First Minister outlined yesterday within our existing competence on childcare. We can do that in a fashion that will lead to the creation of an additional 2,000 childcare workplaces within the workforce in Scotland through funding of £3.5 million the Government will make available for the development of the childcare workforce to increase employment. We can do that within the devolved competence of the Scottish Government. But if we want to take forward the type of transformational effects of the approach on childcare that we set out in Scotland's future, we must have the ability to take the strategic economic decisions to redeploy expenditure to support investment in childcare in Scotland, to support investment in the growth of the Scottish economy, and to ensure that the resources that generates, the benefits that generates for the Scottish economy, can be reinvested to invigorate the Scottish economy, to deliver growth and to deliver new opportunities to the people of Scotland. And I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Ian Gray to speak to and move Amendment 8714.3. A very strict 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Improvements in the employment position, the economic position, the signs of economic recovery outlined by the Cabinet Secretary are, of course, very welcome. But he did, I think, describe them as relatively positive, and wisely, I think, because to understand the fragility of the economic position, we do have to look behind the headline figures, welcome as they might be, at the reality of this recovery for many Scots and their families. The truth is that there are still almost 75,000 more Scots unemployed than there were when the Cabinet Secretary took office. There is a long way to go yet. And true, too, that too many of the jobs which have been created are insecure, temporary, part-time, zero-hour contracts or simply poorly paid. There are around 250,000 underemployed workers in Scotland. That's around 10% of the workforce, and that is a 76,000 increase since 2008. Those are Scots in work, working, but without enough work or enough of a wage to meet their families' needs, far less their aspirations. Meanwhile, recent analysis has shown that the proportion of the Scottish workforce earning less than the living wage has steadily increased since 2008, and 120,000 Scots are stuck in low pay. Across the piece, the workforce has seen wages fall in real terms in every single month since 2010, with the exception of one. So when we here welcome the signs of recovery, many Scots will be left puzzled, because in insecure, underpaid jobs with wages buying less every month, this hardly feels like a recovery at all to them. And we know that an economy built on insecure, low-paid, low-skilled jobs is not a sustainable 21st century economy. Now, I think that the government motion implies that they understand this, but it also implies, and the Cabinet Secretary reiterated this, that as a devolved government, they can do little to address it. That's not true. Now, I think the Cabinet Secretary and I agree that government spending is a key lever to stimulate the economy. I certainly agree with many of the remarks he made that the current UK government have failed to use those levers as they should have. But government spending in Scotland is still billions of pounds every year. Spending on capital projects, yes, but also contracts for goods and services and support for economic development. The government could do more, much more, to ensure that this spending underpins high-quality, properly paid employment. All government contracts should be supporting jobs which pay the living wage, insisting on the creation of local employment opportunities, creating training and apprenticeship places, and avoiding exploitative zero-hours contracts.
Mark MacDonald.
Last night on television, and indeed today on television, two of Mr Gray's Cabinet colleagues have outlined Labour's plans to scrap the small business bonus. How will that help the Scottish economy?
Ian Gray.
I think they did nothing of the kind, but it's an interesting point because It's an interesting point because our position consistently has been that the small business bonus is a missed opportunity because it could have been used to incentivise exactly these issues of employment, training or investment in energy efficiency. It is a missed opportunity by a government who misses so many. It is not enough. No, I'm sorry. No, let me make progress. It is not enough. It is not enough that the government itself pays the living wage and avoids zero-hours contracts. It cannot be right that employers working on a contract like the Borders Railway, fully funded by the Scottish taxpayer, use zero-hours contracts, or that universities, recipients of millions of pounds of government funding, are amongst the worst offenders when it comes to these exploitative terms of employment. And on the other side of the employment equation, as the Cabinet Secretary said, the Scottish Government is responsible for skills and training. There too we need to look behind the headlines. We have an apprenticeship programme of 25,000 places and all work-based, which is good. But is the balance right? Over half of those are short-term level 2 places. Meanwhile, industries like engineering or construction or oil and gas continually complain they do not have enough apprenticeship places. Behind the top-line number, we should and could be rebalancing the programme to match skills to jobs and those sectors with the greatest potential to grow our economy. But the government motion speaks to none of this. Rather, it rehearses the Scottish Government's single transferable excuse, that they cannot do anything until we are independent. And it even hints at the argument the Cabinet Secretary made that somehow there is no real purpose in investing in major increases in childcare to help women back to work because their tax pounds will not come to us. Presumably, that's why the government doesn't think it's worth investing in our colleges either, because young people will only go out and get jobs and send their taxes down to the Treasury in London. The White Paper argues... Yeah, sure.
Bruce Crawford.
Does Mr Gray believe that Scottish firms should pay more in business rates than firms in the rest of the United Kingdom?
Ian Gray.
No, and nobody has said that we should. Well, from a sedentary position, somebody says, where's the money come from? I'm looking at the analysis of the Barnett consequentials. That was the sum of money we were discussing yesterday, and it looks very clear to me that if the government had chosen not to prioritise free school meals, but instead prioritised their own childcare policy, then that would have been achievable. The White Paper... The White Paper... No. The White Paper...
Order, please.
The White Paper argues that with independence the economy will inevitably flourish. And it does, in fairness, set out the platform for that boom. It will build on a currency union within the UK, an open border and free movement of people and goods with the rest of the UK, a single UK-wide energy market, with consumers from across the UK subsidising Scottish renewable energy, UK-wide research funding from which we can win more than our fair share, a single financial services sector across the UK so that Scottish banks can access a home market of 60 million consumers and a single central bank which will bail them out if needed. The rest of the UK will even break the habit of all history and provide us with defence contracts for planes and ships. I tell you, that is a great platform on which to build economic growth, fairness and prosperity, because it is the one that we have today in the United Kingdom and on which we have built prosperity under devolution, as the Cabinet Secretary outlined. No, sorry, I need to carry on. On Monday, the Deputy First Minister demanded to know what would happen after a no vote. Well, here's what will happen. We will keep the pound. We'll keep the UK financial services sector, keep the energy market, keep the Bank of England, keep our open borders with the rest of the UK, and we'll keep our defence contracts, including shipbuilding on the Clyde. All those things that the White Paper says are crucial to our economic prospects. It is a yes vote which would leave us negotiating to get back all these things nobody except the Independence campaign wanted us to give up in the first place. As an argument, that's pretty surreal. But the threat to our economy is genuine. At least that's what economists say. Late last year, the Financial Times asked 31 economists what the impact of independence would be on the Scottish economy, and 27 said it would damage our economy. That's what I read reported over Christmas, but I've actually read what they said now, and it's worth reading. I mean, I thought I was dubious about the benefits of independence, but look at what these economy experts say.
Final minute.
Inevitable uncertainty, huge uncertainty, massive uncertainty, stagnation, damaging, disastrous, unmitigated disaster, a catastrophe. It's not my assessment. That's the assessment of leading economists with no axe to grind. And what does the White Paper propose an SNP government would do? What's the big strategic economic decision that they would take to change this? They would present big business with a corporation tax cut and leave the people of Scotland to find £400 million a year in cuts or increased taxes. As an argument for economic growth, this is absurd. As an argument for fairness, it is utterly ridiculous. And as a reason for failure to take the actions we need right now on the living wage, on skills, on job creation, on childcare and on better procurement, it is only an excuse, and a poor one at that.
Thank you. Now calling Gavin Brown to speak to and move Amendment 8714.4. 6 minutes, please, Mr Brown.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is a long way to go with economic recovery. There can be no doubt that there will be many challenges ahead, and there are a number of potential headwinds that could yet blow us off course, both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. I think that is acknowledged by all sides. But at the moment, from where we stand at the moment, there is a positive story to tell about the economy. The deficit has been reduced by a third. Growth has returned. Employment is up and unemployment is down. This, of course, is acknowledged in the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor's report, but the positive story is happening in the UK as a whole and in Scotland. It's not just happening in Scotland, as sometimes I think the Scottish Government would like us to believe. Because, as we all know, macroeconomic policy is decided at a UK level. But the Scottish Government would like to give the impression that all of the recovery so far is down purely and solely to the actions of the Scottish Government. I asked Mr Swinney directly, is it all down to the Scottish Government? And he couldn't bring himself. He couldn't bring himself at all to admit that even a small crumb of the recovery is down to the actions of the UK Government and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, even though all the macroeconomic powers are held at Westminster. I'm happy to give way to
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Gavin Brown for taking the intervention. Following on from Gavin Brown's comments there, that how can he then justify the ever-increasing number of food banks and the ever-increasing number of people actually going to food banks to actually be fed on a weekly basis?
Gavin Brown.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I made it very clear that we have a long way to go. I made it very clear that there are challenges, but the point I am making is that the position now is far better than it was a year ago. The prospects now are far, well, members in the SNP seem to laugh, but their own Chief Economic Advisor says in his report that prospects now are far better than they were a year ago. Not at this stage. The other point I want to rebut, just from the Cabinet Secretary's point of view, is that he basically says the recovery would have happened years sooner had the UK Government spent a bit more money on capital spending. But he ignores entirely the Eurozone crisis that engulfed a continent a few years ago. He ignores entirely, contained in his own Economic Advisor's report, the fact that the Eurozone, with whom we trade most, had 6 consecutive quarters of contraction prior to the second quarter of 2013. Sure, happy to give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Brown for giving way, but I think if Mr Brown recalls, one of the major points of debate that he and I exchanged during my period of calling for more urgent action and more significant investment in capital expenditure, Mr Brown replied by saying, well, if we did that, that would spook the markets. And the Chancellor is borrowing £197 billion more than he expected to in 2010. My argument was we could have reduced the level of negative economic impact by an earlier decision to expand capital investment and to fund it by borrowing, because the Chancellor's had to increase borrowing for negative reasons, not positive ones.
Presiding Officer, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as he knows, over a period of autumn statements and budgets, did increase capital spend, but when the money was given to the Scottish Government, the so-called shovel-ready projects weren't shovel-ready. 50% of them didn't even have planning permission, and so had the money been given earlier, they certainly wouldn't have had planning permission any earlier. Happy to give way.
But surely the best test of the Government's ability to deploy capital expenditure is the level of capital underspend that the Scottish Government has had in each and every financial year. And that is of a very small level in terms of our capital performance as a government. So surely that undermines the point that Mr Brown is making, that the government is able to spend effectively the capital resources at its disposal.
Presiding Officer, 3 letters NPD, I think, undermines the entire case that Mr Swinney makes. Mr Neil, from a sedentary position, shouted out rubbish when the words NPD were announced. Well, he was in charge of it. He was in charge of it for several years, Deputy Presiding Officer. So we'll take no lessons from him. But let's actually focus on the report of the Chief Economist was an interesting one, because it was broadly positive. There was credit to both the UK and the Scottish Government, but it did also point out some of the headwinds that we will be facing. And that is what I believe this Government, with the powers it has now, should be focusing on now. It talked about export market fragility. The surveys at the end of last year highlighted this, and the most recent Bank of Scotland Business Monitor from Monday pointed this out too. How is the Scottish Government going to respond to that? What about the projections contained within the State of the Economy report from the Chief Economic Advisor? The Item Club, I'm in my last 20 seconds. The Item Club forecasts, and it's only one group and it's only one forecast, but they say that Scottish growth will be 1.9% in 2013, but 1.7% in 2014. There's going to be a reduction. In the UK, it's 1.4% for 2013 and 2.4% for 2014. So it goes from 1.4 to 2.4 for the UK, 1.9 to 1.7 for Scotland. Now, that's one projection. I acknowledge that entirely, but what the Scottish Government ought to be doing, is looking into this, looking at the figures and trying to understand what is underlying that and why a respected economist, one respected economy group, saying this. That's what the Scottish Government ought to be doing now with the powers and resources it has. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move Amendment 8714.1. A very tight 6 minutes, please.
Before I forget, I wish to move the amendment in my name. I'm grateful to the Finance Secretary today, because yesterday I had to scrap my speech because the First Minister had the discourtesy to announce a very positive policy. I'm grateful to the Finance Secretary for not inflicting the same burden on me today, although he may not like the speech that I'm about to deliver as a result. Yesterday's announcement on the expansion of nursery education, combined with the free school meals for early primary years, was warmly welcomed by me. And I give credit, as people heard yesterday, where it is due. But you'll not find a fiercer critic of the Nationalists when they've got it wrong. And that happens, in my view, quite often. But I refuse to condemn them when they get it right. Yesterday, they got it right, and I praise them for doing so. So when I offer my critique of the SNP, as I will today, the Nationalists may disagree, but they cannot accuse me of blind, narrow opposition. That is just not me. When it comes to independence, on the point of blind opposition.
First Minister.
Well, by definition, I can't do that. But what I was going to say was, before he moves on to the critique, can I give him a further opportunity to continue in the positive vein? Because he will have noticed in Mr Swinney's statement the announcement of a further £3.5 million for workforce development in nursery education, so that in Scotland, with the great advice and support of Mr Rennie, that we can avoid the problems that have been demonstrated south of the border, where a lot of that preparation wasn't able to be made. Can I continue in the positive vein just for a few sentences more?
Willie Rennie.
I'm coming out in a rash, but I'm quite happy to continue the praise of the SNP for 30 more seconds. When it comes to, however, and there's a big however, the independence, the economy and finance, I'm afraid there's a bit more of a gulf between our two parties. Yesterday's announcement showed that what we can do with devolution. The Nationalists said that it could only be done with independence. With their actions, they've undermined their very case. Really progressive, fair actions are only possible with a strong economic base. And it's a stronger economy that the coalition government is building. With the difficult decisions in the early days to bring our finances under control, we are now seeing a return to growth that the Nationalists and Labour said would not be possible. Growth is up, business confidence is up, unemployment is down. And we've got 1.3 million jobs, extra jobs, which is mirrored in Scotland with 110,000 jobs. That's almost exactly our population share. There is no, and next to no, SNP jobs bonus. On the one hand, the Nationalists claim credit for the growing economy here, but on the other hand, they say they don't have the powers to grow that economy. It's just like the criticism of the UK coalition government policy, when they say that it would not work, the economic policy would not work, then claiming credit for when it does work. Contrast this economic, this economic growth and rising employment with the uncertainty of independence, uncertainty over the currency. We can't leave the UK, then demand the benefits of the UK. Uncertainty over the terms of membership of the European Union. We can't expect all 28 member states of the EU to agree to our every demand on the rebate or even on fishing rights. Uncertainty over the affordability of public services because of our faster ageing population and volatile oil revenues. Our finances will be tighter. It's not me that says that. It's the Finance Secretary himself in that famous memo that he wrote to the Cabinet. I appreciate, and this is Patrick Harvey's point, I appreciate that no one can ever exactly predict the future. But it's a whole different order of uncertainty with independence to compound the normal uncertainty that we have in life. I don't want to derail the progress that we're making at the UK level on the economy with the uncertainty of independence. I've always been a pragmatic but strong supporter of the UK. I'm a proud Scot, a Fifer, who wants to continue our enduring relationship with our friends across the UK, whether they be in Liverpool, Manchester or in Cornwall, where I lived for many years. I have a vision for a stronger economy and a fairer society, not just for us, but across the UK. As a Liberal Democrat, I want everyone to get a chance to get on. It's why we've increased the tax thresholds to make sure that those on low and middle incomes can actually relieve themselves of income tax. I want to move to a position where those on minimum wage don't pay any income tax at all. We've had pensions that have increased. We've also had the delivery of nursery education and free school meals. These are the benefits of devolution based on a strong economy. Now, Liberal Democrats and Liberals before us have had a long and proud tradition of advocacy of home rule in a federal UK. From Gladstone through Steele to those who made the case and ultimately led to this Parliament. But the job is not done. I want to see the further transfer of financial and constitutional power to the Scottish Parliament, not because I believe in separating power, but because I believe in local power. This will be constitutional reform that is sustainable, a settlement that means we can determine our own destiny on the domestic agenda while sharing risk and reward with the rest of the UK. And the consensus emerging, Devo More, Devo Plus, Labour and the Conservatives, and also the trade unions publishing plans. And I'm sure by the turn of the year, we will have the Nationalists on board for that growing consensus as well. So to conclude, we are building a stronger economy and a fairer society that gives everyone the chance to get on. We are on the right track with the economy. Let's not derail that progress with the uncertainty of independence.
Thank you very much. I now call on Alison Johnson to speak to and move Amendment 8714.2. A very strict 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Satisfying jobs, good affordable homes to live in, clean, thriving neighbourhoods to be part of, security and a chance to prosper in life. These are some of the reasons why a vibrant Scottish economy is important. Some people enjoy these things. We're lucky to live in a rich, developed nation with much potential. But many people are left by the wayside. Poverty and inequality still plague us despite these riches. My colleague Patrick Harvey said yesterday that none of us has a monopoly on wisdom or concern when it comes to creating a fairer economy and society, and that's true. He also argued that independence gives us a chance to imagine a vision, to create a reality for people that differs from successive years where the ultra-rich have got even richer, even as the Western economy hit crisis, and where governments have punished the poorest in society through their vision of austerity. We want something different from George Osborne's austerity forever speech on Monday, something different from David Cameron preaching restraint while surrounded by gold at the Lord Mayor's banquet. The genuine alternative to austerity is equality. Scotland is one of the richest countries in the world, but we must tackle the huge inequalities in our wealth, health, gender opportunities and life chances. We have enough wealth, but it must be distributed more evenly to give those who wish it the opportunity to get a better job, more skills in education, a settled family life and the ability to contribute fully to our neighbourhoods. Football is an important part of many of these neighbourhoods. Greens would like to see new powers in the Community Empowerment Bill give fans the chance to take ownership of their local football or sports club. The economic and social benefits of ownership should be made widely available to our communities. Closing the gap in inequality will require all the social policies already devolved, but it's not enough. The Green Amendment today sets out our reasons why taxation, industry and employment powers should sit in Scotland, to give us the chance to create a new approach to the economy, one that provides for everyone to live well. And what could this look like? A resilient, sustainable economy is based on Scottish businesses and small enterprises, not multinational companies who jump ship for a new tax break. It's based on a diverse network of smaller banks, including mutuals, municipal banks, co-ops, credit unions. They exist to serve small businesses and ordinary citizens, not simply speculators. Publicly owned renewable energy companies, cooperatively owned supermarkets, regeneration and development which actually values people's participation, renationalised railways and successful small businesses are all ways to build a robust economy controlled democratically, not by multinational corporate interests. Greens would like to see the Scottish Government negotiate to turn RBS's retail operation in Scotland into a network of local banks, boosting lending to small business in every region. We have to measure what matters. GDP is not the be-all and end-all, but too many politicians still remain addicted to the impossible goal of everlasting GDP growth at all costs. It's the type of economic activity that matters, not the amount and speed alone. Oxfam's Humankind Index shows that Scottish people prioritise their health, having a safe and affordable home, a pleasant local environment, satisfying work. And while money is important, they don't covet vast wealth. They just value having enough money to participate properly in society. Some employment figures are improving, and that's incredibly welcome for the thousands out of work. But underemployment and poverty pay still burden our economy, and they impact very badly on women and young people in particular. And we must reverse our slide into a low-wage, low-skill economy. Too many people continue to be trapped in poverty despite working very hard. The Resolution Foundation estimates the UK would save over £2 billion a year in welfare payments if the living wage was paid across the private sector. And this is because most benefits for people of working age aren't paid to the unemployed. They are paid to people on low wages. We're effectively subsidising corporations who pay poverty wages. An economy paying fair and decent wages would mean thousands of people in Scotland could escape the in-work poverty trap and increase demand in the economy. Even with existing powers, the Scottish Government could begin to change direction. For example, I would suggest that the £10 million grant subsidising tax-dodging Amazon would be better spent on growing jobs in Scottish businesses who contribute to our society, no matter how difficult they may find that at times. Yesterday's announcement on free school meals, the extension of free school meals, is very welcome. But let's ensure that local food producers benefit from this extra public spending.
Final minute.
Bold action in the procurement bill could ensure that children in Scottish schools always eat, as far as possible, locally produced beef, pork and chicken from just up the road. Recent FOI requests revealed that Scottish school kitchens were serving chicken sometimes from Brazil and Thailand. By producing and by buying local, we will benefit growers, processors, our environment, our children, our economy here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, we need a new economic model that is resilient and provides for everyone to live well. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. We now turn to the open debate. The Presiding Officer has already intimated that speeches should be of no more than 5 minutes, and even with that, we are tight for time. I call Linda Fabiani to be followed by Richard Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was interesting to hear Ian Gray disparage the motion's contention of positive signs of recovery in the Scottish economy over the past year by the good management of John Swinney and his colleagues. Perhaps then he recognises within the motion the reality of Scotland's inheritance from staying too long in a union that is certainly not working in Scotland's interests. The structural problems within the UK economy that came to a head in 2008 have been rehearsed many times in this chamber, and no doubt that will continue this year. It is our view, of course, that if Scotland stays in the Union, any benefits of an economic recovery will be more than outweighed by the continuation of macroeconomic and social policies that are neither supported by most Scots nor suitable for achieving Scotland's full potential. This is especially the case when it seems clear that a central plank of this UK recovery plan is based on reflating the home county's property market, with scant regard for the effects in the rest of the country. And the thing is, it's not just the Tories that back the coalition policies. The Lib Dems' Danny Alexander and Labour's Ed Balls have both made very clear there is a Westminster consensus on the need for further austerity. And indeed, Rachel Reeves MP has admitted that Labour will be tougher than the Tories. Not on those who caused the financial crisis, it's those on benefits that she wants to hammer. So, in 2015, regardless of the outcome of the UK election, I don't believe for 1 minute that we will see any serious attempt to tackle the growing inequality in the UK. An inequality that's not just national, but regional. Nationally, the top 20% of income earners in the UK earn on average 14 times those in the bottom 20%. And regionally, London and the home counties are like a completely separate economy from the rest of the UK, set firmly on the path to boom and bust again by a Tory party that increasingly represents the interests of only that area. As I've highlighted previously, Presiding Officer, Westminster's skewing of economic and fiscal policies to suit the South is matched by a shift of public expenditure from other parts of the UK. Scotland is the worst hit, losing over £8 billion between 2008 and 2012, during which time London and the South received an extra £11.5 billion. Is it any wonder that Vince Cable himself likened London to a giant suction machine draining the life out of the rest of the country? In September, opposition members, including the Labour members who yesterday voted against free school meals and increased childcare, will, along with their Lib Dem and Tory partners, recommend to the Scottish people that they vote to endorse continuation of these policies as preferable to Scots taking the power to make their own decisions. I find that truly bizarre. We've become used to speakers who back the Union emphasising that Scotland faces big challenges, difficult public finances, overhang of debt despite 40 years of oil revenues, and a reducing working population. What they overlook is that these are the products of the Union. These are amongst the reasons that we need the powers to do things differently. Already, with the limited powers available to this Parliament, the SNP government has been able to pursue advantages for Scotland. For example, by supporting small businesses, a policy to which Scottish Labour now seem to be opposed. Patricia Ferguson today saying that Labour would look again at the small business bonus, and Keisha Dugdale last night talking in terms of business rates levels.
Final minute.
We support the renewables sector, which now provides over 11,000 jobs, and we support growth areas such as food and drink and life sciences. As the Deputy First Minister said in St Andrews the other day, Scotland now has the opportunity to choose between two futures. Because for too long, despite its many assets, Scotland has been in decline relative to every country with which it shares a land or maritime boundary. It's only with the powers of independence that we have any chance at all of building a more resilient and fairer economy. As the Deputy First Minister said on Monday, we know what yes means. We heard some stuff from Ian Gray today. Will he get together with his Better Together partners and put something in writing so that the Scottish people can truly judge what a no vote in September would actually mean for the future of Scotland?
Good for you.
I now call Richard Baker to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Presiding Officer, the economic case for Scotland staying within the UK is best made by the SNP themselves. Because despite saying they want independence, in fact they want to keep the pound, keep the Bank of England, keep UK financial regulation and keep single markets in energy and financial services. So even those who oppose Scotland's membership of the UK have ultimately had to concede how important it is for the future of our economy. But the flaw in their approach, which recognises the importance of these shared institutions, is that in each case we know we will retain them if we stay within the UK, but there is at the very least uncertainty over our future membership of them if we decide to break away. A flawed approach from a party whose economic prospectus under independence is predicated on tax receipts from a commodity which is volatile in terms of profitability. As a member for the North East, I am the first to champion the importance and success of our oil and gas industry. But while times are undoubtedly good in the industry now, this has not always been the case, and there is considerable doubt over what the price of a barrel of oil will be next year, let alone in 10 years' time. I hope we can look to another 30 or even 40 years of production, but it's a finite resource. That's reflected in the increased production costs the industry faces in the mature fields of the North Sea. I'll give way briefly to Mr.
Kevin Stewart.
We have a situation where Norway has accumulated a sovereign wealth fund of some £470 billion from its oil wealth. Meanwhile, the UK has built up over £1 trillion of debt and squandered our oil wealth. Would it not be best if we controlled that wealth?
I'll come to the issue of the oil fund in a moment, but we have to remember also that Norway has significantly greater resources in oil and gas than we have. But I will return to this issue in a moment. I was surprised to see, Presiding Officer, before Christmas, the Cabinet Secretary remarked that he couldn't understand how tax receipts from North Sea oil were predicted to decrease at a time of increasing investment in production. But he must be aware that oil being recovered from the North Sea now is often from fields which have already been significantly depleted, and therefore it does require far more investment to produce, and so the tax take will be less. In this context, tax stability is vital for the industry, and I'll be the first to acknowledge the UK government has not always got this right, but the White Paper has precious little detail of what the tax structure for the industry will be. It can't provide any details of how the billions of pounds required for decommissioning will be paid for, although it does say there will be an oil fund even before there is a balanced budget, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. So while ministers might try to spin to the industry that there will be no change in terms of tax, the evidence for that claim is simply not there in the White Paper. And while the SNP want the North East to foot the bill for separation through our oil and gas industry, ministers are failing to provide the investment in infrastructure our area needs and are actively withdrawing services from Aberdeen, from shutting our prison to reducing local police and fire services. Presiding Officer, I will agree with the Cabinet Secretary on much of his analysis of the economic policies of the UK Government. But this referendum is not about one government, but about the future of Scotland for generations to come. It was wrong for UK ministers to cut too deep and too fast, and this approach stalled growth and led to a long period of stagnation in our economy. But while we have made common cause with Scottish ministers on the idea of building our way to recovery, of investing in recovery, their position on this issue is just not credible, given their disproportionate cuts to the housing budget and their singular lack of success in driving forward projects through their NPD programme. And of course, there's a fundamental incoherence about their economic plans for a separate Scotland, promising higher public spending in a whole range of areas and a corporation tax cut, which would cost hundreds of millions of pounds. It's entirely wrong for the UK government to pretend you can cut your way back to prosperity, but equally it's entirely wrong for this Scottish government to pretend you can invest more in public services while cutting taxes for business as well. It doesn't add up. And the fact of the matter is that whatever the colour of the government at Westminster is to be, this Scottish government still wants to retain all the key structures of the UK-wide economy, the Bank of England, the pound, financial regulation, even if it means we have less influence on these key institutions than we did before, and that is with whatever shade or political complexion of government is in office in Westminster. Now, we do need these institutions because even in these tough times, the advantages of being part of that bigger, diverse economy of the UK are clear. And if these advantages are clear to the SNP's own ministers, then I'm sure, Presiding Officer, they will be clear to the people of Scotland as well.
Thank you very much. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. After listening to Ian Gray's comments earlier, it kind of took me back to the old adage of that we're too wee, we're too stupid and we're too poor. But I'm more optimistic about Scotland's future, certainly with independence. And certainly all the evidence demonstrates that Scotland is a wealthy nation. And the OECD, they estimate that Scotland can actually be the 8th wealthiest nation in the world. Scotland's wealth is also built on solid financial foundations, a diverse economy and substantial economic potential in the new industries, such as the biotechnology and renewables, as well as the current key sectors like food and drink, tourism and oil and gas. The Scotland's economy includes the £21.4 billion in construction, which employs 170,000 people, £11.6 billion in tourism, which supports 292,000 jobs, and £39 billion yearly turnover in manufacturing, with a value added of £12.7 billion and 127,000 people employed. Scotland also has world-leading expertise in life science, world-class universities, 5 in the world's top 200, a multi-billion pounds creative sector and vast energy, oil, gas, tidal wave and resources, fishing and agricultural resources. We also perform strongly as a location for inward investment and have a strong financial services industry. Scotland's relative labour market performance has also strengthened. Scotland's employment rate has been higher and our unemployment rate lower than the UK as a whole for most of the recent period. And over each of the last 32 years, Scotland has contributed more per tax per head of population than the UK as a whole. In 2011-12, Scotland provided 9.9% of the UK taxes and received only 9.3% in total UK spending. This means that Scotland would have been £4.4 billion better off as an independent country last year alone. Our public finances have consistently been healthier than those elsewhere in the UK, giving us a strong platform upon which to build economic success and maintain strong services. All of this shows that Scotland can easily afford not only to be an independent country, but to flourish with independence. With independence, we can do so many things. We can build a new taxation system which stimulates the economy, builds social cohesion and sustains Scotland's public services. We can develop a new tax system which can boost our economy as well as the key industries. This may be the renewables industry, where Scotland has 25% of Europe's offshore wind and tidal energy potential and 10% of Europe's wave power potential. We can also focus on the Scottish Government's aim to re-industrialise Scotland. This could see economic, industrial and taxation policies combine to boost our manufacturing sector, pushing it towards the level of manufacturing seen in Germany, where it's around 21% of that country's GDP, in comparison to our current level of around 12%. With such a move, we not only strengthen our industrial base, we provide a more balanced economy, but we also generate thousands of jobs. We can also use the benefits of a fairer taxation system to provide a better social security system, one without a bedroom tax and one which does not aim to be tougher than the Tories, which seems to be the aim of the Labour Party, as stated by the Works and Pensions spokesperson Rachel Reeves MP. With independence, we can send a clear signal that Scotland is one of the most competitive and attractive economies in Europe, with tax rates designed to boost economic activity and support the fast-growing industries that already have a comparative advantage here in Scotland. Corporation tax rates remain an important tool for securing competitive advantage and for offsetting competitive advantages enjoyed by other parts of the UK, notably London. And finally, Presiding Officer, a debate took place in this chamber only yesterday on Scotland's future, and in that debate we heard a confused position coming from the Labour benches. A party of so-called principles, once emanating from socialist ideals, voting against free school meals, highlighted to me everything that is wrong with the Labour Party.
Final minute.
Then, to add to their woe, we had the Labour front bench on TV last night, and also Patricia Ferguson today, questioning the small business bonus scheme, which has been a lifeline to many small businesses up and down the country, and as a consequence to our economy. Thank goodness there is growing support within the Labour Party under the Labour for Independence banner, who know there is a better way for their party and also for Scotland. Although the economy is improving, there are ever-increasing numbers of people going to ever-increasing numbers of food banks, as I mentioned earlier on, and many of these people are working poor, not just those who are unemployed. And I certainly don't understand how this can be a positive, according to the comments from Mr Rennie earlier on. Scotland doesn't need to be like this. We are a wealthy country, and with the powers over all financial matters, we can work to alleviate the current necessity for food banks. Presiding Officer, I urge everyone in this chamber this afternoon to vote for the motion in the name of John Swinney. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now call Ken McIntosh to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Presiding Officer, I was reading about optimism bias over the new year. It is the tendency to expect events and decisions to turn out better than they actually do, from predicting long, successful political careers to losing weight in January. It's a tendency that many of us are prone to, despite the lack of any hard evidence to support such positive expectations. I believe it is a very human characteristic to live in hope. And I'm sure, for example, that after 4 years of doom and gloom, many of us will have greeted signs of improvement in the economy with hope, if not with optimism. Optimism bias is a phenomenon which policymakers are specifically warned to be careful to avoid, or at least to allow for, in their forecasts and plans for the future. So it is no surprise to see that at the time of the autumn statement, economic commentators did at least try to strike a cautious note, with the Office for Budget Responsibility warning that the upturn in the economy was cyclical, rather than indicating stronger underlying growth potential, and furthermore pointing out that it has been fuelled by lower saving rather than higher income. Even yesterday's news on an increase in car sales suggested that much of it had been funded by PPI mis-selling compensation payments, which struck me as ironic, to say the least. But if I have welcomed even modest signs of economic recovery with optimism, the Chancellor has grabbed hold of them with something akin to desperation. In fact, not only is he now trumpeting the success of the UK economy, he claims that the recent figures prove that austerity works. Given that we have spent 4 years lagging behind every other developed country, I entirely share the Cabinet Secretary's view that if the economy is recovering, it is despite the Chancellor and not because of him. But what really worries me, in fact what strikes me as depressing, if not downright dangerous, are the plans Mr Osborne has outlined for the years ahead. For his vision of further cuts to our public services will not only be damaging to our economy, but to our society. Figures released by the OBR at the time of the autumn statement suggest that the Chancellor is en route to cutting back our public services to a level not seen since the Second World War, to a time before the welfare state was developed. Government spending on public services currently stands at around 21% of GDP, but the Chancellor plans to reduce this over the next 4 to 5 years to around 16% of GDP, something not even Mrs Thatcher attempted. Given that borrowing and therefore debt repayments continue to rise under this Chancellor, and that he is committed to increase pensions by at least the rate of inflation, this will put an incredible squeeze on the rest of the public service. In fact, leaving aside our schools and hospitals, this is a vision of a society where the state will struggle to provide our social services, our roads or our libraries, and where market forces will be relied upon instead to meet our needs. Now, that's what I really call optimism bias. I, for one, frankly, do not trust market forces to deliver on the public services many of us rely on. After the collapse of the banks, I barely trust market forces to deliver on the economy. I do not believe the state has to run everything, or is even the best at running everything, but it is certainly part of the picture. And I would go further. If we want to learn the lessons of the last 4 years and build a more sustainable economy, then we need to find better ways of building in accountability, scrutiny and transparency to our economic decision-making too. Economic decisions are not politically neutral, and it is therefore vital that they reflect the values that we hold dear. The German economy has been seen as a model of resilience, and the Cabinet Secretary will be aware of the recent conference entitled Mittelstand, which looked at the lessons we could learn from Germany. Lessons such as focusing on sustainable long-term business planning, on locally rooted and owned medium-sized companies, and most importantly, on an ethical and values-based approach to employment and conducting business. During the recession, these companies coped well, and as a result of schemes such as Kurzarbeit, workers were able to stay in their posts, retaining the collective workforce experience while being compensated for reduced hours to fit in with the demands of the company. We should be looking to develop different forms of ownership to encourage cooperatives, employee ownership, partnerships and so on. Now, these may seem like radical departures from the way we do things now, but with support from the Scottish Government, these models could be developed in Scotland too. And so what's the job of the Scottish Government in this task? Quite simply, to do what we can using the powers we already have. We are already spending too much time talking about what might or might not happen following a vote in 9 months' time. We know that just some of the problems that people and businesses face in our economy include skills shortages, lack of investment, blacklisting and zero-hours contracts. These are all issues that the Scottish Government can do something about now. I'm relieved to see that the Scottish Government is deciding to act on the scandal of zero-hours contracts and to use the procurement bill. But ministers still seem to think it acceptable for billions of pounds to go to large private hubcos who will be entirely exempt from such new measures. Presiding Officer, the former Rabbi Jonathan Sacks said optimism is a passive virtue, hope an active one. So I remain wary of the Chancellor's optimism bias, but I have not lost my hope.
Thank you. I'm afraid members can't go over the time, or other members will lose their time at the end of the debate. I call Maureen Watt to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Following on from the important and exciting announcements on childcare and free school meals, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's further announcement on this issue today. The importance of these announcements cannot be underestimated.
I'm sorry, would you be able to move your microphone up?
As part of the government's aspiration to fundamentally transform the world of work in Scotland and enhance the part women can play in that better future for Scotland. We know that as part of the UK, women's participation in the labour market in Scotland lags behind other EU countries. For example, Sweden has the highest rate of female participation in the workforce in the EU, with Finland and Denmark also above the EU average. In Denmark, 79% of mothers with children under 6 work, whereas the UK figure is 59%. And a 1% increase in Scotland's economic activity rate is the equivalent of an extra 30,000 people in the labour market. The impact of these policies on gender equality is clear. The top 4 countries in the World Economic Forum Gender Gap Index are Iceland, Finland, Norway and Sweden, with Denmark also in the top 10. Our Nordic neighbours are also leading the way in standards of care for the elderly, with the highest satisfaction rates occurring in these countries. So we can see that our ambitions for an independent Scotland require transformational policies never even contemplated by any Westminster government. Indeed, a Scottish Government analysis shows that many women in Scotland are already and will be worse off as a result of Westminster changes to the benefits system. According to an IFS analysis, single female households will lose out most through welfare reforms from 2010 to 2015. Presiding Officer, our opponents say that focusing on childcare is a cynical ploy to woo the female vote to independence. And even still today, many of those, particularly on the Labour benches, don't understand the pivotal nature of childcare provision in growing the economy and reducing gender inequality. While we have seen that expanding childcare in itself will increase job opportunities, and as Professor Ailsa Mackay wrote, every woman in Scotland should welcome the commitment to a transformative expansion in childcare, there are other barriers facing women in employment and wanting to return to work. The Women's Employment Summit, in partnership with the Scottish Government and STUC in September, discussed these barriers, and as a result, a number of strands of work are progressing. So the Government is, for example, funding the Women into Work project, which tracks the progress and outcomes of women on employment programmes. The CareerWise Scotland initiative works to step up action to encourage young women and girls to consider careers in science and engineering. And this builds on the work of the Royal Society in terms of tapping all our talents. The re-establishment of the Cross-Directorate Occupational Segregation Working Group aims to tackle occupational segregation. So we see all these proposals progressing, and at the same time industry sectors picking up on this. So for example, I think as Nanette Mill mentioned earlier today, Aberdeen Journals through Energy and Energy Voice, together with women in the oil and gas industry, are beginning to challenge the male chauvinism and male domination in that industry.
Final minute.
In the renewables sector, we saw the recent launch of WIRES, Women in Renewable Energy Scotland, aiming to increase women's participation and progression within that industry through networking, mentoring and information sharing. And I welcome Aberdeen University's intention to celebrate International Women's Day this year by hosting a Women's World event by inviting high-profile women led by Anne Glover to inspire other women. Ian Gray moans as usual, but conveniently fails to mention that employment law, equal pay, minimum wages, etc. still reside with Westminster. We know the dynamic direction of travel with independence. We know too the no action with Westminster. I support the motion.
Thank you. And I now call Margaret McDougall to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the optimistic predictions based on indicators outlined in the State of the Economy Government report. But I note the underlying theme that runs through the document of the fragile nature of the current state of the economy and its recovery. So while a more optimistic picture is presented, we must not be complacent because, as the report states, there is a growing recovery in the UK, US and more recently the euro area. It further states that sustaining the recovery in Scotland in the medium term will require an improvement in underlying competitiveness linked to a sustained pickup in productivity and real wages. If these aspects fail to pick up, we could easily find the recovery stagnating. The report states at page 22 that there is still a significant number of people in employment who would like to work more hours. I've spoken in this chamber regarding the scourge of underemployment and zero-hour contracts before, and I still believe this is something that we must tackle to get our economy back on track. Zero-hour contracts offer insecurity and unpredictability, often meaning that the individual is underemployed for a significant period of time. And of course, there is all the uncertainty of income, the turmoil of benefit claims and arranging childcare associated with zero-hour contracts, which causes so much misery for those of us who have no option but to accept this type of work. In 2012, according to the Office of National Statistics, 250,000 people across the UK were under a zero-hours contract. This is the highest it's ever been. The underemployment inquiry the EET committee carried out showed that people want to work more hours, but the opportunity isn't there, and they are classed as being in full-time employment. As of September 2012, there were 264,000 underemployed workers in Scotland, 10.7% of Scotland's 2.48 million workforce. As I've previously stated in this chamber, the Scottish Council for Development and Industry has described underemployment as a long-term challenge for the economy of Scotland. It's clear we need to meet these challenges head-on if we are to sustain our recovery. The Procurement Reform Bill gives us the opportunity to tackle underemployment and zero-hour contracts within public-funded contracts. Ed Miliband pledged in September 2013 to ban the exploitive use of zero-hour contracts when Labour returns to government. Will the SNP match this pledge using the Procurement Reform Bill to lead the way and lay the groundwork for a better and fairer Scottish economy? On the issue of real wage increases, we should support the living wage, and I find it disappointing that it's not mentioned anywhere within the Government's Procurement Reform Bill. It's all well and good I'll give way briefly.
John Mason. I'm grateful for the member giving way. Would you agree, and I think it was the point that Alison Johnson made as well, that if we could push up the statutory minimum wage, that would be even better than the living wage? Margaret McDougall.
I think we need to have the living wage and then across the board. It's all well and good to tell us things will be better under independence, but why should the public believe that when this government doesn't use the powers it has to protect workers and grow the Scottish economy now? Presiding officer, in uncertain financial times, we need a government that is committed to looking for ways to grow the economy, not a campaign vehicle. The independence referendum adds another layer of uncertainty. According to the Financial Times 2014 survey, many respondents believed that independence would hurt the Scottish economy and the rest of the UK, and that the current uncertainty and about what will happen would undermine confidence in the Scottish and the UK economy. Uncertainty we don't need. People are crying out for action now, not action in 12 months or even later. Independence is a distraction. I'm in the last minute, sorry. Independence is a distraction, not a solution to our economic future. This government should be using the powers it currently has to improve the quality of life for all Scots. So can we get a firm commitment today that the Procurement Reform Bill will be used to tackle underemployment, zero-hours contracts and introduce the living wage in public service contracts? Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Murdo Fraser. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, perhaps one of the most inspired things that this Scottish Government has done has been the setting up of the Council of Economic Advisers. No one can doubt the credentials of the members of this council, which include 2 Nobel Prize-winning economists. And we can be confident, therefore, that the Scottish Government has access to high-quality economic wisdom, which is both objective and robust. And that's why we can also be certain that the economic sections of the White Paper are carefully crafted. And that's why we can be certain that we have an economic plan in which the Scottish people can be confident. That's why we can also be certain that we have an economic plan that's credible to business in the business community and also in the eyes of the wider world who are watching Scotland with interest. But it's instructive to look at Scotland's economic performance over the longer term. Between 1997 and 2007, we saw average growth of around 2.3%, compared to 2.8% across the UK. Since 2007, we have outperformed the UK economy across almost every economic measure. So this tells us something about the economic competence of this SNP government in comparison to its predecessors. But we must consider too the background against which this has been achieved, as we have faced the twin challenges of the worst recession in living memory and the economic illiteracy of the Tory government in Westminster. Presiding Officer, any government can seem to be successful in the boom phase of the economic cycle, as Gordon Brown demonstrated. But it's an inescapable fact, which Gordon Brown is finding out, that any government will struggle to reduce its deficit unless the economy grows. By his own promises of deficit reduction, George Osborne has failed. And that is why he is now signalling his intention to move into a further phase of austerity plus. I'm sorry, I'm short of time. And against this backdrop, the underlying strengths of the Scottish economy can be seen clearly. Oil and gas with 24 billion barrels of recoverable oil and around 13 billion of investment this year. Renewable energy with 25% of Europe's wind and tidal energy resource and 10% of its wave energy resource. A very significant opportunity opening up with Europe's most significant carbon capture and storage opportunity in the North Sea. 300 years' supply of coal, just as we're poised on a breakthrough, for clean coal technology. Not to mention record exports in food and drink and a fast-growing life sciences sector. I could go on, but what this amply demonstrates is that we're building a diverse and therefore resilient economy. Yet another lesson the UK government could learn from Scotland. But instead, the Tory government is relying on pumped-up property prices to ensure their re-election, with the nationwide survey suggesting London property price inflation over the last year approaching 15%. This is a continuation of the uncertain and unsustainable economics that we have seen from the UK government over many years. With independence, we could do much more. There is, for example, a cast-iron case for reducing air passenger duty. The increase in VAT alone would pay for this. There's a similar and a robust case that can be made for reducing VAT on building repairs, which would pay for itself in increases from other areas of taxation. This is the opportunity that devolution denies us, the opportunity of wisely using fiscal policy to produce both economic benefits and higher returns on taxes, the opportunity to tackle poverty and improve the business climate, the opportunity to establish that virtuous spiral where fiscal rewards arise from sound economics and success builds on success. Presiding Officer, Scotland's economy is recovering well from recession. With the full powers of independence, we can look forward to a prosperous future.
Many thanks. Now Colin Murdo-Fraser to be followed by Colin Beattie. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think we can all agree with the very first few words of the Government motion today about the positive signs of recovery in the Scottish economy. Indeed, as both Gavin Brown and Willie Rennie said, all economic indicators are now positive and much better than many people predicted. And this debate is a welcome opportunity to scrutinise the SNP's judgment on economic issues, never more important as Mr Swinney and his colleagues are seeking to have the power to run the economy, not just of a devolved country, but of an independent one. And the reality is, if we look at the evidence, the SNP just got it wrong when it came to predicting what would happen in the economy. Because for years they were telling us that George Osborne's approach would ensure there was no economic recovery. In speech after speech, the First Minister and Mr Swinney and their colleagues called on George Osborne to change tack and end his obsession with austerity. Time and time again they told us that Plan A had failed and it was time to go for growth. Thank goodness George Osborne didn't listen and instead stuck to his guns, and we are seeing economic growth as a result. Now, at least some of Mr Osborne's critics have had the good grace to accept that they made a mistake. Professor David Blanchflower, a man often quoted in this chamber by those on the SNP and Labour benches with a love for Keynesian economics, writing in The Independent on Sunday this weekend, said, and I quote, "I was wrong. I hadn't expected the economy to grow as much as it did last year or for the welcome drop in unemployment." Now remember, Deputy Presiding Officer, this was the man who predicted a triple-dip recession and predicted that unemployment would reach 6 million. Professor Blanchflower got it wrong on all these counts, but at least he had the good grace now to accept he got it wrong. It would be good to hear that from others. Perhaps Mr Mason will oblige us.
John Mason.
Well, I was just wondering if it was not true that Mr Osborne also got it wrong because he had had to borrow a considerable amount more money than he had planned to borrow.
Fraser.
Well, maybe Mr Mason missed the Eurozone crisis being much deeper than people expected, but my point is absolutely clear. All these predictions of doom and gloom, all these predictions from the SNP about a decade of stagnation have not come true. You should have the grace to accept that. And let's look elsewhere. Look at socialist France. For years, held up as an alternative to the austerity approach being followed in Britain, Germany and elsewhere. At the start of this year, just 2 weeks ago, François Hollande, the French president, said that he was now committed to reducing public spending, reducing the deficit and reducing taxation. So the critics of austerity have found their cheerleaders, like Professor Blanchflower and François Hollande, silenced, and they too should have the grace to accept they got it wrong. Now, the Government motion today makes reference to the question of inequality. This is a mantra repeated regularly in this chamber by SNP members who say, and they state it as a fact, the UK is the 4th most unequal country in the developed world. A very convenient claim for those who want to be entirely negative about the United Kingdom as part of the unremittingly negative Yes campaign for separation, but a claim not supported by the facts. Now, there are different measures of inequality. One measure is inequality of incomes. No, I need to make some progress. According to figures drawn up by the UN, the World Bank, the CIA and the OECD, in terms of income equality, the UK ranks at 43 out of 156 countries in the world. In terms of the 34 countries in the OECD, we are ranked 28th, which, according to my arithmetic, does not make us the fourth most unequal. But income inequality is only one part of the story. Perhaps more important is the question of distribution of wealth in society. And here the data tells us something quite different. The Global Wealth Data Book 2013, produced last October by Credit Suisse, puts the UK at 14th out of 34 OECD countries in terms of equality of wealth, comfortably in the upper half. Crucially, we are more equal in terms of wealth than France, Germany and Switzerland, and indeed the supposed Scandinavian paradises of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. So those who want an independent country so we can be more like Scandinavia should be careful what they wish for. And the trends are important here too, because research by both the Office of National Statistics and the Institute for Fiscal Studies make it clear that inequality of income in the UK over the last decade has been reducing. The ONS report, published July 2013, said that inequality of income in the UK is at its lowest level since 1986. The IFS takes a slightly different approach and says that inequality is back where it was in 2005-06. But whatever study we use, the consistent message is inequality is reducing. Now, the SNP won't like these facts, I can tell that from the murmurs we hear. But as George Adams said in the debate yesterday, they will take the view that facts are unimportant in a debate like this. I think we should rely on facts, not assertions. They won't like it. They got their call on the economy wrong. Why should we trust them to run an independent country?
Thank you. Now Colin Beattie, to be followed by John Mason. Sorry, we're tight for time. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish economy is one of the most fundamental issues underpinning and driving the need for independence, especially so when taken in the context of the performance of the UK economy as a whole. The Scottish recovery, which is strongly influenced and guided by the Scottish Government, has its roots in long-term sustained growth, unlike the rather shaky and uncertain economic management Westminster has applied in recent years. This very week, we've seen the Chancellor of the Exchequer state that the UK requires £25 billion of further cuts. Needless to say, he's yet again targeting the most vulnerable in society through shifting the burden of cuts onto the welfare state. Half the cuts are expected to come from the welfare bill. This surely will result in more socially unacceptable measures, like the deeply unpopular bedroom tax, which, as we know, will be eliminated under an SNP government in an independent Scotland. Early December saw the Institute for Fiscal Studies pick apart the Chancellor's own budget. The reluctance to implement scheduled increases in fuel duties, combined with other factors such as the creation of marriage allowances in the tax system, will add an extra £7 billion of spending in the period from 2015 to 2016. And you'll note that this date is after the general election. Cuts in public service spending are expected to accelerate from 2.3% a year in 2016 to 3.7% a year from then until 2019. Meanwhile, the IFS warns £750 million of free school meals in England and Wales are unfunded from 2015. But perhaps Mr Osborne expects not to be the Chancellor at that point and is leaving that as a problem for the next UK Government to solve. Meanwhile, by contrast, the Scottish Government will be introducing properly budgeted and funded free school meals for Scottish school children, primaries 1 to 3. The recent increased growth forecast, the IFS states, is merely anticipated growth arriving sooner than expected. In effect, this growth is already forward discounted. This also coincides with the British Chamber of Commerce's report that growth will be hampered in 2014 if the UK Government does not encourage corporate lending. Present artificial blockages on lending to small and medium-sized businesses are restricting essential investment in the likes of new plant and machinery, of course.
Gavin Brown.
Does he agree that it's important to always listen to what the IFS has to say?
Colin Beattie.
I think it's interesting the points that I'm raising here from what the IFS has to say, because some of it it is very critical of what the UK government is doing. This also coincides with the British Chamber of Commerce report that growth will be hampered in 2014 if the UK government does not encourage corporate lending. However, I'd like to focus on the key successes in the Scottish economy in recent times, which must be considered in the context of Scotland providing 9.9% of UK taxes, and yet only receiving 9.3% of public spending in return. As recently as yesterday, the latest Bank of Scotland monitor reported a surge in business activity continuing from the summer through the autumn. 37% of businesses reported a rising turnover, while volumes of repeat business continued strongly over the period. To quote Donald McRae, the Bank of Scotland's chief economist, the recovery was accompanied by high expectations for the next 6 months. When the facts are examined, we can see that our economy is fundamentally healthy and strong in its diversity. Our construction industry employs 170,000 people and provides over £21 billion to the economy, while our tourism industry employs almost 300,000 people and provides over £11 billion to the economy. Between 2011 and 2012, we generated £1,700 more tax per person than the UK as a whole, and this has been the case for the past 32 years. We know that Scotland's fiscal deficit is lower than the UK's, standing at 5.4% compared to 8.5% of GDP. Further, our public spending stands at 42.7% of GDP compared to the UK's 45.5%. Clearly, this shows that our public finances are in better order than the UK as a whole. An independent Scotland would have the opportunity to start oil exploration off the coast of South West Scotland, a move that the Ministry of Defence has previously blocked, as it would interfere with the operations of Trident nuclear weapons submarine fleet at Faslane. Now, surely it would be more prudent, indeed essential, to boost local economies ahead of dumping outmoded nuclear weapons in Scotland, which it neither wants nor needs. This is all in the context of a deeply imbalanced and unequal UK economy, presided over by Westminster politicians who do not care to dwell on the real issues and instead continue to implement and maintain austerity measures that do nothing but increase inequality and hardship. Only by taking Scotland's economy and future back into Scotland's hands can we realise the potential of this country. The alternative is stagnation and further fracturing of our society.
Thank you. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Hans-Ala Malik.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think we can start on a positive note. There are encouraging signs in the economy. The Bank of Scotland economic update we received recently had figures like GDP had risen for 4 successive quarters, employment rose 11,000 in the quarter ending October 13, and the data suggesting that recovery continued into November 2013. We can also see that Scotland is in a relatively strong position internationally, with GDP per head 8th out of 34 in the OECD. And in comparison to the UK, Scotland has been stronger for these last 30 years, already quoted. The reality is we have been and we are subsidising the rest of the UK. However, other things are not so positive. I'd like to make a few comments on population to start with. One of the failures of the UK has been uneven population growth between England and Scotland since 1707. And not surprisingly, this lopsided population growth is reflected in a lopsided growth of our respective economies. If we want better public services and we want businesses to grow, it's a lot easier to achieve this if our population is also growing. Scotland has lost a lot of its population over the centuries, whether through emigration, unjustified war or whatever. As a result, we can be considered an underpopulated country, and in fact, it's only recently that the population has stabilised. Of course, immigration needs to be managed, but if we are serious about growing businesses, growing the tax base and growing public services, then we really need to have more people. When I was younger, Scotland had well over 0.1% of the world's population. We are now well under 0.1%. We cannot afford to keep slipping at this rate. And another aspect of this has been the tightening of student visas, with the loss of the post-study work visa. I very much welcome the fact that this could be reintroduced if we controlled immigration ourselves. The motion, amongst other things, says, quote, recognises that Scotland's long-term potential will continue to be hampered by the large gap between rich and poor. I thought this was very well explained by Alison Johnson. And it's noticeable that in the amendments, only the Greens left this bit in the motion, the amended motion, whereas the other three parties all took this bit out of the motion and, as far as I can see, did not replace it with anything similar. Now, it's not only true for Scotland's economy, it's also true for the UK, the EU and the world as a whole that this gap between rich and poor damages the economy. As Murdo Fraser has accepted, the UK economy is one of the most unequal in the developed world as far as income is concerned. We rank 28th out of 34 OECD countries, which I reckon makes us 7th worst. Some feel that closing the gap between rich and poor is a luxury that we can't afford at the moment, of course.
Fraser.
I'm delighted Mr Mason for giving way. Does he also accept the evidence from both the ONS and the Institute for Fiscal Studies that over the last decade inequalities of income have been reducing across the UK?
I think the problem I have with that, and I accept that I'm making comparative figures as well, but it's what I see in the ground. I can go into a restaurant in Glasgow and it is packed out with people who have money and are spending a lot of money on nice meals. And I can go out of my constituency office and I can see people who are really, really struggling to live. Now, that's the reality of that. That is the gap that I'm seeing. And OK, we can make comparisons, but there is a gap that I find unacceptable. And it may be some people feel it's just on the wish list, and we may get round to it eventually if the economy grows a bit more, but I do not believe that is the case if it's brief, yes.
Thank the member for giving way. Would you accept that the SNP, since coming to power, have taken £1 billion out of local authority poverty projects through taking away ring fencing and taking away money from Fairer Scotland Fund and funds like that? £1 billion from poverty projects in your term of government?
45 seconds, Mr Mason, please.
Well, one thing I know is that when I was in COSLA, all the parties wanted to stop ring fencing. And secondly, all we can really do in this Parliament, with the budget we have, is to move money around. So if there's £1 billion less in one place, then it's in the health service or it's somewhere else. That money has not vanished. And if you want to take £1 billion out of the health service, then that is entirely up to the option of Labour to put that forward. By contrast, we look at other countries. If money is taken out of the economy, rich people will spend it differently from if the money is spread around more evenly. If it was spread more evenly, that would boost all of the economy. So the risk that Labour mentioned in their amendment is that they want to share with the rest of the UK, presumably is the risk that we have a Tory government 50% of the time, and I find that unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Hanzala Malik, after which we'll call Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to congratulate Glasgow City Council for their Glasgow deal. This is a UK government initiative allowing cities to earn back money invested by councils through income tax, corporation tax, VAT and PAYE contributions, which is more than what the Scottish Government is doing, and it is stimulating the economy amongst our cities, which is to be welcomed. In the absence of the Scottish Government doing this, they should support cities like Glasgow, who are doing so much to improve jobs and revitalise our industry, which will in turn help improve our economy. Whilst employment numbers are up, they are nowhere near pre-recession figures, and I am keen to know what steps the government is taking to protect people from zero-hour contracts, and would welcome a response from the Cabinet Secretary to say what steps he has taken and what improvements he can demonstrate that he's achieved. The government suggests independence will greatly enhance our economy. However, their own white paper suggests otherwise, as keeping the single currency, the pound, the central bank, the Bank of England, clearly suggests Scotland's economy is better placed within the United Kingdom. So please, let's not kid ourselves, and more importantly, let's not try to kid the people of Scotland. We really need to be clear and not mark time. Keeping Scotland on hold is not in anybody's interest, and I assure you this is no solution. One needs to be realistic. We have enjoyed over 300 years of economic unity. It will not be easy to unpick all of that complex links for our economy. It will take, which has taken the UK, and expect it'll be trouble-free. If we expect it's going to be trouble-free and cost-free, I don't think that's going to be the reality. I have looked through the white paper and I see a wish list, which concerns me, because many of the items on that list have not been agreed, not been substantiated. There is no evidence to support it, and I don't really want to follow the Pied Piper down a cliff. I think that I would really like to see, I don't want to see a fragile economy. I would like to live and see a strong economy. And so I am sure none of the people in Scotland would like to do the same. So no thank you on that one. And I just want to go through some of the issues that concern me, and I think that, there clearly is no answers. And I'll be interested if the Cabinet Secretary would correct me if I'm wrong. I understand that we want the pound, but we have no agreement to do so. We want the Bank of England to be the last resort, but we don't have any agreement to do so. Monetary policy, regulation and discharge by the Bank of England, not by the Bank of Scotland, on your white paper, page 404. HMRC, across translation period, no agreement. I'm not aware of any. Joint Cooperation Financial Compensation Scheme, I don't know of any agreement. Motor Services Agencies, DVLA, have you got an agreement? I'm not aware of any agreement. Where are these services going to come from? Electric and gas marketing, including renewables, I don't know of any agreement. Yes?
No, he won't. He's in his last minute.
Thank you, President.
You have 30 seconds to go.
Thank you. Telecommunications, I mean, the list is endless. It goes on and on and on, and it really worries me. And there's one part where I saw that we are not actually going to be able to do anything about the lottery system as well. What does that mean? That SNP is not going to be able to run a Manoj? Surely to God, they're not suggesting that. Passports. And the other thing that surprises me is its share of public sector debt. How much is that going to be? Where is it going to come from? Who's
Sorry
going
to have to stop
it?
you, but you must close, please.
So please, if you'd be so kind to explain to me how you're going to actually provide all these services without the agreements in place. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. And now call on Kevin Stewart. 3.5 minutes, please, after which move to closing speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to recognise the contribution that Aberdeen and the North East makes to the Scottish economy. And it's estimated that last year oil and gas production contributed around £22 billion to the Scottish GDP. And yet it seems that some folk in this chamber think that oil and gas is a problem and a millstone round our neck. What I would say for the oil and gas industry is that decisions taken by Westminster governments have been a millstone around their necks, and we have seen 16 substantive changes to the tax regime in a decade, and that has actually stopped development in some areas and has caused underperformance in the North Sea Basin. That is one of the reasons why I think that we should have control over all of these elements of policy. Let us turn to some of the things which have been said today. No, I've got 3.5 minutes. Let us turn to some of the things which have been said today and yesterday about small business. Some 92,000 businesses in Scotland at this moment in time are benefiting from the small business bonus, providing jobs for many, many people across this country. And yet we have seen an attack on the small business bonus over the past couple of days from the Labour Party. Just this afternoon, in response to Stuart Maxwell on Politics Scotland, where Mr Maxwell asked, "Would you cut the small business bonus?" Patricia Ferguson replied, "We would certainly consider that." While not mentioning the small business bonus per se, last night on Scotland Tonight, Kezia Dugdale suggested removing funding from support for small business. And yet Ian Gray here today denies that that is in their plans. I have to say that these interventions by two frontbenchers rather call into question the standing and the authority of the Labour finance spokesperson and the Labour leader. I think that you need to tell the public exactly what your plans are when it comes to small businesses. You actually have form on this, because from 2001 to 2007, rates under the Labour Party, business rates here in Scotland, were higher than they were in the rest of the UK, costing small businesses some £900 million over that piece. £900 billion that small businesses could have used to invest and expand in their businesses. And let's not let the Tories off the hook here, because between 1979 and 1995, small business rates were higher in Scotland than they were south of the border. These are the reasons why we need all of the levers of power in this Parliament to ensure that our economy grows from strength to strength. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Now move to closing speeches and call on Patrick Harvey. Up to 6 minutes, less would be more, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's often my way to scatter a generous mix of praise and criticism on both sides of the chamber, so here goes. Mr Swinney was quite right to be a wee bit tentative in his acknowledgement of signs of economic progress. I think he used the phrase stable, if not uniform, progress. But he then immediately started defining progress in terms of GDP growth only. In discussing employment, he focused on overall numbers, not the nature of employment or issues such as low pay. In talking about the strength of the economy, he saw it purely in output terms. Now, the problems that Greens see with this economic mindset, it relates to what I would call the outgoing economic model. These problems cannot all be laid fairly solely at Mr Swinney's door. And we find little to disagree with in most of his motion, and I suspect he's interested in, at least sympathetic to some of our arguments in these issues. But he continues to define economic success in the terms laid down by the economic model which has already failed us. Like most other political parties, recovery to him seems to mean getting back to business as usual. So while we do have much in common, we part company as soon as the debate becomes that sterile contest as to which government can more convincingly claim the credit for the most recent GDP figures. As for the Labour Party's contribution, Mr Gray recognised certain aspects of the employment picture which do need to be acknowledged. Underemployment, low pay, 0 hours contracts, insecure conditions and people facing rising living costs at the same time. He made the case, and I agree, that a devolved government's hands are not fully tied in these matters. Public contracts are an example that he gave. I agree, and I'll be supporting amendments to the procurement bill in this regard. And I would also agree that instead of a simplistic, untargeted small business bonus, we could design a business rates scheme which genuinely incentivises ethical practices in business, investment in quality new jobs and local sustainable resilient economies. The same case could be made in relation to those corporate welfare payments, the government grants which are too often paid, as my colleague Alison Johnson noted, to the likes of Amazon instead of indigenous small businesses. So while we have common ground as well with Mr Gray in many of these areas, the rest of his remarks were limited to a simplistic attack on independence. That's a case he's perfectly entitled to make, and I've no doubt that he does it with sincerity. But I was hoping for some unpacking of the comments in his amendment about new powers to achieve some of the things that we want to achieve. I was hoping that we'd hear more of that after yesterday's debate. I'm personally not open to the jam tomorrow argument, but I think many people want to know. Malcolm Chisholm clearly wants to know, as in yesterday's debate when he talked about the economic advantages that would come from more fiscal devolution, even if it's just all income tax staying in Scotland. So there's clearly an appetite for more, even on the Labour benches. But we heard nothing of that today. As for the Tory and Lib Dem contributions, those speeches focused on that shallow argument, is it the UK or Scottish Government which can claim the credit for the least impressive recovery from a recession in living memory. Now, they would like Mr Osborne to be hailed for this great achievement, and all the while he is planning to raid billions more from the pockets of society's poorest people. The agenda of the UK Government is clear. Austerity to them is not a necessary evil, it's the new normal, an ever smaller public sector, an ever more denuded welfare state. Well, those who believe in that agenda should be honest about it, and those who claim to oppose it should give up the ministerial cars and join with those who seek to bring down that government as soon as possible. What was missing from the other party's contribution is provided by the Green Amendment and was articulated by Alison Johnson, a new, sustainable and democratically accountable economic model where we challenge the myopic obsession with GDP at any cost, where we invest in the public services which we all depend upon, where we protect small businesses and local economies from the domination of vast multinationals, whether in banking, retail, energy or any other sector. Deputy Presiding Officer, in closing, I want to mention Willie Rennie, because Willie Rennie asked me to accept that there's a whole new level of uncertainty that comes with independence. Now, few people in this chamber might be open to persuasion on either side of this, but I would make the case that it's a whole new level of possibility which independence creates. Not the guarantee of this more radical agenda that I'm suggesting, but merely the possibility. And I contrast that with a whole new level of certainty in a status quo that it's time to reject. That's what the opposition to the independence movement represents.
Thank you. Now call on Willie Rennie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
I thought Richard Baker's contribution actually hit the nail on the head. I think the argument that independence would bring more freedom, more possibility, as Patrick Harvie would claim, but that everything would stay the same, that we would keep the pound, the single market, the common travel area, all the things that are good about the UK, apparently independence would retain. So I thought Richard Baker's contribution was a good contribution. I also thought, actually, the exchange between John Mason and Murdo Fraser on inequality, which I thought was a thoughtful and actually engaging exchange on it, where Murdo Fraser set out how the kind of claims on being the most or the fourth most unequal society, country in the modern world were kind of disputed in terms of when he brought in the wealth arguments, and then John Mason's practical experience on the ground in Glasgow. I actually think I'm dissatisfied. I think some of the figures, the analysis is wrong, but I'm dissatisfied with the levels of inequality in the United Kingdom and in Scotland. I want that to change. And that's why we've, not just now, if you could turn down the volume a wee bit, I can still hear him. That's why we are so passionate, and why we talk about it so often is about the tax thresholds. I think it's appalling that people who are on minimum wage pay income tax. I mean, these people deserve every chance that they can get to move on in their life. They've made the effort to take a job that's not particularly rewarding, is not particularly well paid. Why are we taxing them? We should be taking them out of tax altogether. That's what, not just now. That's why we are proposing to take the tax threshold up to £12,500. That's why we want to make that change. And that's why I'm particularly disappointed in the White Paper, which promises so much. It actually says we'll just increase the tax thresholds by inflation. Just by inflation, not proposing to match what Lib Dems would like to do across the United Kingdom, not recognising the transformational effect it can have on incentivising people into work by raising those tax thresholds. So I thought that exchange was a useful one, but actually in some ways it missed the point. Is the action that we need to take in order to reduce inequalities is something that I think we should be prioritising. I'm always fascinated by the nationalist claim that independence will mean we're free from the fiscal controls imposed by George Osborne, Ian Duncan Smith and the so-called Conservative government. We are in it. We are in it. Believe me, we're in it. We feel it. But if you look at the actual SNP policy on independence, it's actually proposing to wed Scotland to such a government, not remove. Talking about the welfare, for instance, state welfare. I mean, the claim repeatedly is that £2.5 billion, depending on which figures you use, £2.5 billion has been taken out of the Scottish economy because of welfare cuts by Westminster. Now, if you look at the White Paper, the proposals on welfare is that only the bedroom tax is scrapped, that PIP and the universal credit is scrapped. There is no mention of restoring the £2.5 billion, not one mention of restoring the full so-called cut. In my calculation, the SNP have only agreed to reverse 2% of that £2.5 billion, leaving 98% of Ian Duncan Smith's budget cuts in place. Now, if I'm wrong, they should tell us otherwise, and they should tell us how they're going to pay for it, but I have not seen it. But there's a reason for this. It's because if you look at the Fiscal Commission report, the Fiscal Commission report has set out in detail, in order to have, in the context of the oil fund, we need to control spending in Scotland, in an independent Scotland, and follow the same downward trajectory as the UK on the control of spending. No. So they're going to match the timetable on the reduction in spending. But they're also proposing, in order to keep the pound, to have this monetary union with the rest of the United Kingdom, they're proposing a fiscal pact. And a fiscal pact would put in the hands of the rest of the UK Treasury, the George Osborne of the future, they would put in his hands the control over Scottish spending. So two proposals, the Fiscal Commission set out in detail, but also the proposals on the fiscal pact. So this claim that somehow we're going to have this massive increase in spending to undo all the evils of the UK government is just not the case. And it's in detail in the White Paper, not just now. So it is quite clear that the claims, the wish list in the White Paper, are not based on reality. Now, Patrick Harvey's point about more powers. I mean, we are passionate about more powers. We've got a long tradition about committing to more powers for Scotland. We fought for this place alongside many others, and we want to go further, because I think we can get the best of both worlds. Many of the things that I think the nationalists would like to achieve with having more power closer to home can be achieved with Home Rule in a federal United Kingdom. We can achieve the different way that we want to do things on the domestic agenda, while sharing with the rest of the UK the risk and the reward. The risk and reward with the rest of the UK, where they get the benefits and the best of both worlds. That's what we should be striving towards. And that's why I agree with Patrick Harvey that we should be setting out more of this detail on this. And that's what we've done. That's what we encourage more to do. And I think, therefore, we'll get a sensible constitutional settlement for the whole of the United Kingdom following that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Gavin Brown. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's been a rather interesting debate with some interesting contributions. And first, I would say it's clearly a new year. And so we have a new SNP approach to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Last year's demons, who could not be taken seriously because they failed to predict the collapse of the Berlin Wall, should now be taken extremely seriously and quoted verbatim by backbencher after backbencher, of whom Colin Beattie was the finest example. So I look forward to hearing the SNP quote the IFS analysis in the coming months, all the way to the referendum in September. We had an interesting contribution during an intervention from the First Minister himself, who talked about workforce preparation for nursery staff because of the extra hours that the Scottish Government are providing. He said it's very important, Deputy Presiding Officer, that we don't implement these things too quickly. We have to get the workforce preparation right. Well, given that this was a promise made in 2007 in a document entitled First Steps of an SNP government, nobody would accuse this government of doing things too quickly, given that it won't happen until later on in this year. And then we had a contribution from Kevin Stewart, which I agree was too short at 3.5 minutes, but he basically stated that we could just have an oil fund like Norway and all would be fine. Now, he's clearly missed the latest SNP memo, which says they are no longer having an oil fund. They're having 2 oil funds. One is quite simply not enough. But I will give way in a moment when I finish this point. But the point is this. For the Norwegian oil fund, their onshore tax revenues cover almost all of the spending that they have. And so that the money they make from oil, almost in its entirety, not in its entirety, but almost in its entirety, is a surplus. And they are therefore able to put that into the oil fund. The position in Scotland is entirely different. We would be relying upon the revenues from oil to fund public spending, and we would still, in most years, have a deficit. I said I'd give way to Kevin Stewart. I'm happy to do so.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you. I think you'll find from the official report that was questioning of Mr Baker rather than in my speech. In terms of spending our oil wealth on public services, would it not be better to spend that oil wealth on the vital public services rather than illegal wars and Trident nuclear weapons?
Gavin Brown.
Well, okay. So I don't know where the oil fund goes if we're spending it on everything else, but never mind. And I'm happy to correct the record. Kevin Stewart didn't say that in his speech. He made the rather absurd point in an intervention to Richard Baker. So I'm glad we've cleared that one up. But let's come back to some of the most important points, because the fundamental point, I think, made by my party and by other parties in this debate is that the Scottish Government does have the powers now to do many of the things that it could and should be doing. We face economic challenges now. We have headwinds coming in the short term and in the medium term, and we do have some levers that we can use now. But I think the Scottish Government is so concerned with the referendum and independence that we don't have our eye on the ball, and we're not doing many of the things we could and should be doing. The report by the Office of the Chief Economist, I think, was an excellent report. It made a lot of points, and a lot of the news was indeed positive, as we all, I think, have to acknowledge. But it did raise issues of concern, and these are the issues that the Scottish Government needs to focus upon now. What is the Scottish Government's response to export market fragility? We haven't heard a response from the Government yet, although surveys through most of the second half of last year highlighted this danger. The Bank of Scotland Business Monitor report, quoted again by a number of speakers today, says export activity is showing a negative trend over the last 3 months after a nearly flat performance the previous 3 months. Why is that, Deputy Presiding Officer? Is it just a blip? Maybe it is, but if it's not, government ought to be doing something about it. And what about the forecasts projected forward? When I mentioned the Item Club forecast, the Cabinet Secretary shouted out, "What about Fraser-Vallender?" For the record, Fraser-Vallender said that there would be growth of 1.3% in 2013 and 1.8% in this year. So they did predict an increase of, from 1.3 to 1.8. But another equally respected commentator says it will go from 1.9 to 1.7. Now, who knows who is right? But the point is this. The point is this. If you have a respected commentator suggesting that growth will go from 1.9 to 1.7, when the UK is projected by the same commentator to go from 1.4 to 2.4, then questions have to be asked by the government. A deeper analysis is required. And looking at that deeper analysis, is there something that the government here can be doing with its levers to try and counteract that, to ensure that we do get increase in growth? There are other points pointed out within the State of the Economy report, whether it's the US interest rate rises, which are expected at the end of the tapering off of its stimulus. What impact will that have on Scottish businesses, given that the USA is our single most important international export partner? And what about conditions across the Eurozone if the growth doesn't happen there? What is the impact going to be on the Scottish economy there? We do have levers, Deputy Presiding Officer. There are issues on what the Scottish Government should be focusing on now, and that's what we call upon them to do. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now Colin Jenny Mara, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No child should be left behind. Those were the words of the First Minister when he introduced his youth guarantee. A job, a place in education or training for every 16 to 19-year-old in Scotland. An offer for Scotland's youngsters who, in times of recession, have watched their opportunities evaporate before they have had the chance to take them. And it was Pope John Paul II, presiding officer, who told us that there is dignity in work. But for our young people, there is also dignity in the prospect of work. In times of recession, the knowledge that there are no jobs to go to is distressing, debilitating and destructive. So when Joanne Lamont came to the Chamber in April last year to question the First Minister on his youth guarantee, she recounted her days as a teacher under Thatcher, where the aspirations and hopes of those she taught were extinguished by a government who did not deliver the jobs her students worked hard to achieve. And she went on to question the First Minister about the 17,000 16 to 19-year-olds in Scotland who had vanished from the Skills Development Scotland system, the vehicle to deliver the SNP's promise of a job, training or education for every 16 to 19-year-old in the country. 17,000 school leavers whose hopes and aspirations of a future career had been guaranteed by this First Minister and the SNP. It has now been 10 months since that guarantee, 10 months for the government to take action and to make good on its youth guarantee for those 17,000 young people. And we talk about Scotland's economy today, and these youngsters are the hope and future of our economy. But over the past 10 months, the government has passed the referendum franchise bill, the independence referendum bill. It has devoted days, weeks and months of civil service time to papers and preparation of its white paper on an independent Scotland. Yet in those 10 months, the Scottish Government have only managed to find 2,000 of those 17,000 youngsters that they have lost from the system. Figures... Yes.
I think it's only appropriate for a point of clarification, Presiding Officer, that those aren't missing youngsters, that Skills Development Scotland has actually increased its endeavours to contact young people in need of opportunities, and those are young people who, despite our efforts, that we don't know where they are. And that's one reason why we supported and you failed to support the Post-16 Reform Bill, which is about improving data collection and placing a statutory responsibility to ensure that every agency is signed up to ensuring that we share information about providing the best opportunities for all of our young people. Why did you fail to support the Post-16 Bill?
Jenny Mara.
The Minister knows very well why we didn't support the Post-16 Reform Bill, because it was a dog's breakfast of a bill that didn't go nearly far enough in the radical measures that were needed for widening access. She knows very well why we didn't support it. We made that case several times. However, if she can say that it was that bill that would have found these 15,000 people that her agency, Skills Development Scotland, have failed to find, then I think that's a very interesting proposition, because figures released by Freedom of Information in late December show that there are still these 15,000 school leavers that the government cannot find, her agency's own responsibility. 15,000 who have not been given the opportunity of a job, training or education that they were promised by the First Minister. And that means, Presiding Officer, at the current rate of progress, it will take 6 years for the Scottish Government to find these young people, meaning, of course, that they may never benefit from that promise of a job, training place. So when we debate Scotland's economy and we hear of the SNP promise a better future for our young people under independence, let us take an honest look at our progress now. And what of the future for our young people under the SNP's economic vision? The White Paper states that the Scottish Government may extend their youth guarantee for those up to 24. It may. And of course it is an uncosted policy with no detail of how the money will be raised. So our young people, many of whom will be voting for the first time in September, have a real choice to make. They can either put their faith in the SNP, or they can choose to vote for the United Kingdom and 6 months later for Labour's I'm happy to take an intervention. They will... Yes.
Derek Mackay.
For taking the intervention. Can I say that the rate at which the Labour Party abandoned their policies yesterday and today, you'll have none left by the rest of the week, never mind by the next manifesto. But my question is around tax competition advantage. Is it not the case that Mr Finlay blew the gaff yesterday when he said our corporation tax policy was fine as long as it was a British tax policy, as long as it was the case across the British Isles, just showing that Scotland's economy can only be stronger with independence?
Jenny Mara.
I do not accept that point at all. Mr Mackay well knows that we think that corporation tax is better charged by the UK on the strength of the whole UK economy. That is a point that is perfectly clear, and is perfectly clear in what Mr Finlay says as well. But 6 months after the referendum, young people in Scotland will actually have the opportunity to vote for a real youth guarantee outlined by Ed Miliband, which will see every young person to the age of 24 who has been out of work for a year guaranteed a job for 6 months, courtesy of a tax on bankers' bonuses. This is, in a minute I will, this is a real commitment. It is fully costed, it is fully funded, and it is ready to be delivered in 2015, 6 months after the referendum.
With respect, please.
So I hope the Minister, in her intervention, may be able to match that commitment, that guarantee for people up to 24, that guarantee with the tax on bankers' bonuses under an independent Scotland. I would invite her to do so.
My question to Ms Mara is, why wait until a young person is unemployed for a year? That is way too long. And why won't she join this government in calling on the UK government now, like every other European country, bar the UK and the Czech Republic, to implement the European Youth Guarantee, which is about intervening now with the powers of Job Centre Plus and welfare. We could be intervening now within 4 months. Other European countries are implementing the European Youth Guarantee. Why is Labour
in the UK for an intervention,
not supporting
please.
the European Youth Guarantee
30
now?
seconds, Ms Mara.
I think the Minister makes her own point. She could go a lot further with the powers she has now, and I'm asking her... This is silly, is it? I don't think this is silly. This is certainly not silly for the young people to whom we are offering a real youth guarantee, offered, costed, fully funded and ready to be delivered by Ed Miliband. Yes, delivered by Westminster, but much more radical than you are proposing, or you proposed in your white paper.
Thank you very much. That's perfect. Mr Swinney, you have up till 5 o'clock.
Presiding Officer, this has been a very interesting and very useful debate this afternoon, and I think the most stunning revelation of the entire afternoon was the fact that Ken McIntosh spent his Christmas holidays reading a book about optimism bias. I was very surprised by that, because I've always had Mr McIntosh amongst the cheeriest on the Labour benches. I never thought he had any need. Perhaps it's a need to temper his optimism. It was why he was reading a book about optimism bias. But nonetheless, he certainly does bring a ray of sunshine when he makes a contribution from those benches over there. Mr McIntosh went on to make a very substantial point about the lessons that we can learn in Scotland from the conduct of the German economy, and particularly the McMicklestand conference which took place in Scotland. And he also talked about the importance of encouraging a diversity of ownership and employment structures within the economy. And I want to make it very clear to Parliament today that this is an area of close interest for the Government. We will be in a position very shortly to say more to Parliament about some of our interest on this question, because I think at the heart of the points raised by Mr McIntosh are important points to enhance the economic approaches within Scotland, which can be strongly influenced by long-term strategic direction, which can support a stronger approach to economic development and economic growth, and that fits comfortably with the Government's agenda that we've pursued since 2007. In the course of the debate, of course,
Neil Findlay.
I wonder if I could ask him, what's the corporation tax rate in Germany?
Well, if Mr Finlay wants to go around asking me a whole variety of different questions, having just bounced into the debate, not with the optimism bias of Mr Finlay and Mr McIntosh, I'd have to say, and all the usual cheerfulness that Mr Finlay brings into the debate, he can carry on doing that. But if he'd been here all afternoon, he would have heard the thoughtful contribution that Mr McIntosh made on the German industrial structures. My colleague Maureen Watt also made a very important contribution on some of the practical steps being taken by the Government and by other organisations to tackle the issues of gender segregation within the economy. And of course, the Government is very keen to make as much progress on these points. But as my colleague Maureen Watt made clear, many of the issues of responsibility here are reserved to the United Kingdom Government, and this administration certainly would willingly assume those responsibilities to tackle some of these questions to improve the economic performance of Scotland. I thought Linda Fabiani's contribution very aptly dealt with the point that was raised by Jenny Mara in her closing contribution, where Ms Mara suggested that if people voted no in the referendum in September, they would be able to vote for a Labour government to change everything and make everything fine in the spring of 2015. The unfortunate difficulty with that analysis is that Linda Fabiani raised the comments made by Rachel Reeves, who wants to be tougher on welfare and benefits than even the harsh Conservative and Liberal government that we are becoming accustomed to. So there is no prospect, even if there was to be the election of a Labour government in the spring of 2015, of a different direction from the hard, unsympathetic, prolonged austerity agenda of the current Conservative and Liberal government, because of the decisions and commitments that the Labour Party has made to sign up to the approach of the current UK government. Now, Alison Johnson and Patrick Harvie have both raised substantive points in the debate, and the amendment that Alison Johnson has put forward, the Government can't support it, not because of anything that's in it, but because of what it removes from the Government's motion on the Business Bulletin. But I do want to say to both Alison Johnson and Patrick Harvie that the Government, and I hope this is, I know Mr Harvie is making the point that I was talking earlier on in terms of GDP, but the Government's approach that it's taken on the National Performance Framework has been designed to pursue a broad range of indicators about economic, social and well-being considerations within our economy to ensure that we adequately consider all of the different factors that need to be looked at in terms of delivering greater prosperity and opportunity for the people of our country. Now, Mr Rennie made a contribution. I thought it was the start of a trend that after yesterday's contribution he was going to become entirely and wholly supportive of the government, and I do hope that's the case if it emerges. But he did change tack a little bit to talk about the uncertainties of independence. And I would just delicately point out to Mr Rennie that he is in a coalition government with the Conservatives, who wish to put to the people of the United Kingdom the question of whether the UK should remain as part of the European Union. And if he wants to know about uncertainty, that is the issue that is causing uncertainty within the business and economic community of Scotland. And if Mr Rennie needs any evidence to substantiate that, I would suggest he goes and looks at the Ernst & Young UK Attractiveness Survey for 2013, which concludes that, contrary to the speculation that the Chancellor has come out with, that somehow the independence debate was going to harm inward investment, when the Ernst & Young Attractiveness Survey said that Scotland had delivered a sparkling performance years after the Chancellor said that we would be facing difficulties, and that, if anything, the reverse of any difficulty caused by the referendum debate was actually the case. And I think Mr Rennie would be well served to go and have a good look at that survey. And of course I could go.
Willie Rennie.
I happen to agree with him on the referendum on the European Union. That's why we are firmly in favour of staying in the European Union. And I hope that he will join me and others who are in favour of the European Union, so that we can stay and we can continue to grow within that structure.
I'm very clear on this. I want Scotland to be a continuing independent member of the European Union. That's my very basic position on all of this. Now, Presiding Officer, there was a fascinating exchange between Murdo Fraser and John Mason on the question of income inequality. And I thought Mr Mason's response to Murdo Fraser's point in illustrating from the perspective of a constituency member serving an area of high deprivation in Scotland, brought to life the difficulties that we are all seeing in our communities today about the contrast of the way in which wealth is held in some parts of our society and the acute difficulties that members of the public are facing in our communities. And I thought that brought it to life. But I think we have to be very careful. The government statistics on the measures of income inequality are driven by the work of the UN Human Development Report. Professor David Bell of Stirling University has been very sceptical in his paper Inequality in Scotland, Trends, Drivers and Implications for the Independence Debate of measures of wealth inequality, which Mr Fraser was trying to peddle, saying that income inequality has a clear impact on the ability of individuals to consume goods and services. And indeed, the very survey that Mr Fraser cited said, and I quote, "The study of global household wealth is at an embryonic stage. Much work remains to be done to refine the estimates of wealth level by country." So I think Mr Fraser has got to be careful about the citing of those particular reports. Now, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I want to just close on the general tenor of the debate which has been brought forward by Ian Gray, Richard Baker, Margaret McDougall, on whether or not this government is actually using the powers at its disposal to deliver economic recovery. And I want to be clear to Parliament, we are using every single lever at our disposal to deliver economic growth and economic opportunity in Scotland. But we are crystal clear that there is more we could do with a wider range of financial powers. If we grew our 4 largest tax receipts in Scotland by 1% and reduced welfare spending by 1% by getting people into work, it would benefit the public finances by £350 million. Under the Scotland Act, only £45 million of that resource would come here to Scotland. If we take the steps to boost the Scottish economy, we should be able to retain the proceeds of that wealth and invest it to tackle the very income inequality that Mr Mason talked about, and which should be the challenge and the purpose of all of us to create a better future for our society here in Scotland.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Scotland's economy. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 8716 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8716.
Formally moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8716, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 8718, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a Stage 2 timetable for the Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8718. No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 8718, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 8719 on the designation of a lead committee.
Moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come. There are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that in relation to today's debate, if any of the amendments are agreed to, the subsequent amendments fall. The first question then is that amendment number 8714.3, in the name of Ian Gray, which seeks to amend motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney on Scotland's economy, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8714.3 in the name of Ian Gray is as follows. Yes, 49. No, 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 8714.4 in the name of Gavin Brown, which seeks to amend motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney on Scotland's economy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8714.4 in the name of Gavin Brown is as follows. Yes, 14. No, 95. There were 5 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 8714.1 in the name of Willie Rennie, which seeks to amend motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney on Scotland's economy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8714.1 in the name of Willie Rennie is as follows. Yes, 19. No, 95. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 8714.2 in the name of Alison Johnson, which seeks to amend motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney on Scotland's economy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 8714.2 in the name of Alison Johnson is as follows. Yes, 4. No, 110. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney on Scotland's economy be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 8714 in the name of John Swinney is as follows. Yes, 60. No, 51. There was 1 abstention. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 8719 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should leave quickly and quietly.